This August, we will be hosting philosopher Dylan Shaw, whose work orbits both the study of German idealism and the philosophy of religion. This month will function as an invitation to rethinking metaphysics, with ancient, modern, and postmodern philosophy. To get involved during our live sessions this August, or to access the recordings indefinitely, sign up below. Welcome to another philosophical conversation. My name's Gddel Last, and I'm here today with a long-term friend of the channel. You'll know Daniel Garner from OG Rose. We've had previous conversations about his book series Belonging Again. We've also had several other conversations about many different philosophical topics, which you can find in the backlog of the channel. But today we are here to celebrate the release of the second book in a different series, a series titled The True is Not the Rational, and this specific book is the second book in the series titled The Map is Indestructible. Daniel, I think if I was to frame The Map is Indestructible in terms of the central tension you're getting at, it's something like, and you can correct me or make adjustments if I'm not framing this well, we enjoy our ideology and we abhor the real.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, that's a good way to
And
put
then
it.
and then finally the question, how might we make better, given we
Yeah.
enjoy our ideology and we abhor the real?
No, I think that is a wonderful way to sum it up, and I appreciate the chance to speak with you, Cadell. I always look forward to speaking with you, and I appreciate you giving the book a look and a read and being willing to speak about it. Indeed, map and ideology, the opening of the book, kind of in the introduction, we'll talk about the influence of Zizek's thinking about ideology on my own thinking, my encounters with a man named Alfred Korbowski, who wrote a book called Science and Sanity, who is the originator of the phrase, the map is not the territory. And really he's kind of one of these great thinkers that I think have been lost. And he basically wanted to argue that if we don't understand how maps work, and by maps, obviously, he's speaking more metaphorically about what I end up calling an internally consistent system, a way of creating coherence in reality in one's life so that you can function. And the reason we do this is, in fact, for, you could say, sanity. We need to be sane. But what Korbowski is getting at, which I think Zizek is also getting at, is that the very mechanism by which we create sanity for ourselves actually has the mechanisms of creating insanity if we don't notice how this works, right? Because we have to create a kind of, you could almost say, virtual reality of the real so that we can handle the real. And this virtuality, this simulacra, whatever language we want to use, is how we are able to function as human beings. But eventually, that map is going to encounter issues it cannot adjust for, it cannot account for. And if we're not ready for that, then we can be shattered. We can be completely overwhelmed by the realization that our ideology, and I will be using the language map, ideology, internally consistent system, very much like similes. One could make arguments that these terms could be made distinctions, but for our purposes here, that is not necessary. And it is also very important when I talk about a map, I am talking about this phrase, an internally consistent system, which means the following. A map is not merely a notion. A map is that of which entails no essential contradictions to unveil that it is not correspondent with reality. Nowhere in the map are you given reason to think that it couldn't be like the territory. You know it isn't the territory, but just because it's not the territory doesn't mean it can't practically be the territory in the way that it helps you understand reality. And a map never gives you an experience in its consistency that it is not enough like the territory to practically be the territory. And this is very important because a map, therefore, never necessarily has to force you to get rid of the map in the encounter with difference or the shock of the real or something like that. You can always take those experiences and fold them back into the consistency and keep your map going. Well, the reason why this is very important to understand is that very activity of ever folding the surprise and the difference into your map eventually actually leads to insanity. Because the amount of complexity and difference that you're encountering on the outside of your map that nevertheless doesn't have to necessarily destroy your map creates this ever forcing things to fit into the consistency in a manner that will make you insane, but actually in a manner that never makes you have to realize you're insane. Because basically what it just means is you're always kicking out otherness. You always remove the truly other. And in a globalized, pluralistic world, in a world that's ever connected with technology, Korbosky is writing at the beginning of the 20th century, there's this understanding that the amount of folding into maps that has to occur for people when encountering complexity is so great that eventually the psyche will basically be functioning in an insane manner. And this will lead to war. This will lead to tribalism. This will be a reestablishment of basically small fascist states. There are things that come from this mechanism if it is not identified. And so there's a double move here that Korbosky really wants to point. Without maps, we go insane. But if we don't realize how maps work, we also go insane. Oh, but maps do everything in your power to make you realize they don't make you go insane. They feel like sanity, right? Oh, and here's the other problem. The book also wants to stress that after Kurt Gödel, and I'd have to go into this, the realization that your map is not the territory actually is not enough to make you give up your map. Because incompleteness now is now part of maps. And so the very fact that you encounter difference that doesn't automatically go into your consistence, you can say, oh, well, I expected this. My map actually had an account for this because I knew it was fundamentally incomplete. So actually, critically, far from incompleteness, which does not mean there is no truth, that is not what Gddel is saying. Incompleteness actually contributes greatly to the problem of maps, not overturn it. Maybe your initial knee-jerk would say, oh, well, Kurt Gödel's incompleteness, that means we don't have to worry about maps anymore because people know that maps are not the territory, liar's paradox, all the stuff he talks about. So great, that's going to help us be more rational. No, it doesn't. Because you can make incompleteness a feature of your map. So now the encounter of that which may show your map is incomplete is part of the map itself. And that paradoxical move actually makes them indestructible now. And that means the problem of map proliferation, the spread of all of these different ideologies, is much more powerful after Gddel than actually before. Because before, the incompleteness may be taken as evidence that, maybe I need to rethink my map. Now you can say, no, I don't, because incompleteness is actually part of it. Now, but without getting too far ahead, this leads to where the book talks about residing in the Gddel point, the realization of the trade-off between correspondence and coherence. There is a proper way to deal with this, but only in an entirely different orientation of the subject to their maps. And that is going to require overcoming the enjoyment one gets from the map and actually a willingness to face the real. If we do not do that, the problem of maps is complete. Maps are ultimately indestructible, but just because they're indestructible does not mean we can't reside or dwell and relate to them in a different way that opens up new conditions of possibility. And that also then means that if the way we're dealing with difference or global pluralism or all these other things is by efforts of destroying maps, or unveiling that maps are just maps, or showing that ideology is just ideology, that will never work. And then, of course, the next level to this is when Zizek points out, he's like, yeah, knowing that capital is just, a restriction or oppression, it still works on you. You don't have to believe in the horseshoe for the horseshoe to continue working on you. Knowing the map isn't the territory does nothing. And so that is, the book ultimately wants to make us rethink what thought is doing by its own devices to change our relation to thinking, to open new conditions of possibility. I will pause there. Those are some opening thoughts.
Fantastic. So, on this idea of rethinking what thought is doing, while I was reading, I was recalling a story that I learned about, I think when I was reading Richard Dawkins. It was definitely when I was studying evolutionary biology. And it was about a study on spiders, where, of course, spiders spin webs. But these scientists they wanted to know, how would a spider respond if the webbing in its body was removed, if it was anatomically impossible to spin a web? And funny enough, they discovered that the spider still tried to spin a web even when the webbing was anatomically removed from the spider. Now, what I want to frame with that story is what you talk about in between the book, The Age of Givens and The Age of Maps. So I would say something like, if the Age of Givens is the pre-modern world where we're, as it were, instinctually spinning webs, that is, instinctually making maps, I want to suggest that the Age of Maps is kind of like having our webbing surgically removed, not by biologists, but by philosophers, deconstructing the map itself. And yet we're still spinning webs without the capacity, we're still going through the motions of spinning webs. So I think that on the side of the Age of Givens, you might have a more instinctual map making, which I think might contribute to how you frame it in the book as a kind of thoughtlessness, which has its upsides and downsides. But then in the Age of Maps, where we're continually instinctually spinning around making maps even when we don't have the webbing, you have much more of a tendency to madness. You have much more of a tendency to basically avoid the hard work of, how does thought work, how does map making work, how do humans work. It's kind of like both are approaches of avoiding the human, or the challenge of the human. So what I ultimately want to say there is, the way you frame this is the challenge of global pluralism, as and we can romanticize this and we can utopianize this, but we can also create an apocalyptic scenario out of this. Ultimately, in terms of learning how to be better map makers, how do we work with both the incompleteness and the indestructibility?
Fantastic. As the short answer is, we have to have maps that take into consideration the space between other maps, which are outside of the maps, which therefore is a contradiction that nevertheless only the subject can hold in the Gddel point. So that is the very loaded answer that has to be unpacked. But the moment you start actually in your map taking seriously the space between maps, and that those maps that you're also taking account of run in contradiction with your own map, and yet nevertheless that constellation is exactly the reality of our world that has to be held together. A map can't hold that together, but a subject can. But they only can if they work through a whole lot of negativity, anxiety, and strangeness. And it would be kind of alien to hold that all together. Why would you make your focus the holding together of maps as opposed to making a map like the territory? That doesn't make any sense. Well, that is actually the contradiction that opens a lot up. Now, that has to be unpacked, but that is kind of looking ahead. I really like the example you gave of the spider, because I think that's perfect. And I think it will also help point on the manner by which maps are indestructible. One of the reasons the map is indestructible is coming out here between Belonging Again 2.1 and 2.2, because it felt as if the topic of maps was really necessary to discuss in light of the loss of givens, which givens are these thoughtless principles by which we operate. They are non-rational, that create the conditions and framing of our rationality so that we can function. Say, 200 years ago, you're born in Virginia, you're Christian. Christianity isn't what you think, it just is what is. And rationality, what is rational to do with your time, is relative to that isness. Well, as you introduce pluralism and otherness, Christianity is an option. And as it becomes an option, you ask the question, why that option instead of another option? Which then destabilizes you, and it's not even clear what it would mean to be rational. And in that, there can be a disavow, or not wanting to think about it, or looking for a strong man that's going to help you not think about that, or looking for some sort of non-rational principle that removes otherness so that you can reestablish a given and go about your business. And a non-rational principle that can tempt you is nationalism, racism, religious fundamentalism. There are and we see this happening now. People are looking for new non-rational principles to establish their rationality, because what is happening is that, and the Map is Indestructible is volume 2. Volume 1 is called The Conflict of Mind. I do not think people need to read The Conflict of Mind to read The Map is Indestructible. I hopefully on YouTube there's enough summaries, but one of the main ideas of The Conflict of Mind is basically to show the idea of rationality without some sort of non-rational foundation or truth is not possible. Well, if that's not possible, and we don't think that problem, then people are going to just slip back into things like fascism, or slip back into reifying geography or the land or the soil as the basis of identity or capital. Like, we really have to take seriously what the Scottish Enlightenment is saying, which a lot of people say, well, the Scottish Enlightenment leads counter-enlightenment, that leads to fascism and whatever. Yeah, it does. And yet they have really, really important points that if you don't think, you run from, then that's going to haunt you and you're going to slip back into it. So taking that seriously to show that unreflective rationality ultimately just leads into conflicts of mind, which is where the mind is in conflict of the inability to establish a rationality without that which is beyond the rationality, outside the rationality, non-rational. If you don't take that conflict seriously and think it, then people are going to address that conflict on their own, and they're probably going to address it by some sort of return to the pre-modern or return to something prior and avoid the now, because the natural response to anxiety is to think of it's the now's problem. The reason we have this anxiety is because we did something wrong. That's kind of the natural response, as opposed to going, no, we feel something's wrong because history progresses one contradiction at a time. You're supposed to be experiencing contradiction. That is the motion of progress, if you will. But of course, if people have not been taught that, there are a lot of problems. The reason I say all this is because when you lose givens, then people are going to be looking for manners to return to previous pre-modern structures. And the way they'll do it is, because if they don't have givens, is to reestablish maps that are practically like givens, because you can't find any internal contradiction that would necessarily unveil they are false. And so they become, and that's why the age of givens tends to lead to maps. And that is like the spider that can no longer make the web, but it's practically going through the motions of still doing it. And a way that I'll metaphorically frame and then give an example of all this is, imagine the spider even realizes it's not making web, but it tells itself, any minute now I'll start. Any minute now I'll start. Any minute now I'll start. And I actually just need to keep going through the motions to be in practice for when the web comes back. Actually, I better not actually stop, right? That spider is practically indistinguishable from the spider that is actually making a web in terms of givens, right? They're practically indistinguishable, even though there's technically a difference. The second spider isn't actually making a web. The first one is, right? If we associate the web with givens, right? That practical similarity is enough to existentially stabilize the spider, per se. And the key, something you've pointed out in a number of your talks that I think is actually very important. Why do we continue to see this reoccurring messianic idea, that eschatology? Why does eschatology appear in so many ideologies? Because that is a key incompleteness that allows the continuation of the spider. I'm just about to make a web. I'm just about to make a web. I'm going to stay in practice. Eschatology is one of the most popular ways that maps stay indestructible, because the thing that will unveil the map is enough like the territory to practically be treated like the territory will be at the eschatological moment. The moment capitalism is overthrown, the moment Jesus comes back, the moment the technical singularity shows up. And so one of the key moves of indestructibility is eschatology. And that's why it's such a reoccurring pattern in maps, because it allows you to continue practicing the activity. And instead of the given, this is what you're doing. You're making the givens in the future. It's given that Jesus will come back. It's given that the technological, it's of course not a given, but it's practically similar, where if the past can't give you the given, then you do it in an eschatological move, and that is enough to keep the map going. And here's the issue. You can't prove that the second coming won't happen. You can't prove that capitalism won't work. You can't prove a negative, right? And so the map is indestructible, because it's dependent on in order to destroy it, you would have to unveil the eschatological moment will not occur, which you can't, right? And you can't have certainty, right? And that is enough then to keep the spider going. It just has to get rid of it just has to make sure it doesn't encounter any spiders that threaten its eschatological moment. Like anyone who says that's not going to occur, anyone who adds questions to it. Well, then the spider slows down now because it's questioning its eschatological moment. Well, we got to kill that guy. We got to remove that guy. We got to get that person out of here, right? And so what ends up happening is indestructibility today often takes the form of its incompleteness is in something eschatological, which creates indestructibility within various ideologies. So the question is the following. What would be step one? And I'll pause, although there's so much to say. What would be step one to addressing this problem? Well, to deny yourself the eschatological moment, to deny it to you, to say, no, we're not going to, maybe there will be a second coming. Maybe the technological singularity will do X, Y, and Z. Maybe it will, but you hold it with an open hand. Because you actually can't say no. That point is true, because that would require certainty, right? But instead you say, well, we're just not going to think it. If it occurs, it occurs, right? If it doesn't, it doesn't. That's not the role of thinking. The role of thinking, most thinking is used by maps to justify the map, to maintain its eschatological moment, to maintain its consistency. And if you're not careful, that is what you'll naturally use your thinking to do. For thinking to think itself is to notice it does that, and to negate itself, to open up, no, we're just going to think the open hand. We're going to think the now. We're going to think not how is my worldview consistent, but actually ways to hold together all of the different maps in a manner that is existentially very difficult to do. But if we cannot do, everyone is ultimately going to fall back on eschatological justifications, or there are other ones, but that's a big one, that will keep them, that spider that's always making its web, and not know it. And then, of course, the other dimension to it, the logic of capital. Capital will come along and figure out how to make money off of spiders not making webs. It'll figure out how to, this is the other key problem, is capital is going to come along while this is all going on and figure out how to market to that spider that's not making web. And then capital just it actually has incentive to keep this going, because it will figure out a product that, makes the spider happy, right? So indestructibility also is something that's advantageous to capital, because if you have an indestructible motor or indestructible motivations in terms of people reestablishing coherence, that's infinite. That's potentially an infinite market if you can figure out how to market that. Now, that's the econ side of this conversation versus the pure epistemological considerations. But this issue of the indestructibility of maps is also a way that capital has adapted to continue going with the loss of givens. Because the loss of givens should be a threat to capital, right? If nothing is given, then why is capital given? Shouldn't there be something different, right? Well, it's because capital is uniquely positioned to adapt and actually benefit from the motivation that people reestablish in ideology. And of course, this is where Zizek starts to come in, because it's the connection between ideology and capitalism, right? That's the other kind of angle to this, but I'll pause there.
Well, I just want to first say about how do we work with the challenge of the human, given that our maps are both incomplete and indestructible. It seems to me that, again, weaving together your work with this metaphor of the spider, it's like the only real defense, you say yourself, the only real defense is the real of subjectivity. The subject can hold together the maps, but not the maps themselves. And what I was thinking about with the metaphor of the spider is, are you weaving with others, or are you trying to catch flies? Right? Are you just trying to make are you just trying to make a map so you can catch flies, catch others in your web? Now, catching others in your web will give the illusion that you're interacting with others, or give the illusion that you're weaving with others, but it actually wouldn't be real weaving with others. Then there's many different considerations that I was trying to think through on the eschatological line. Before I get to that, I wanted to say that in the same way that I was thinking, about this indestructibility and incompleteness, I think that politically, on the progressive end, you can say there will never be a map to realize the revolution, on the one hand, right? Like you'll never be able to find the map that can realize the revolution, you know, and for my subjective personality and my subjective temperament, I certainly had to rid myself of that illusion. Like that was a real illusion, right? Like I was, you know, and I had to rid myself of that illusion. And there was a certain mourning that came with ridding myself of that illusion. But what you know, and I gravitate to the work of Catrone because he's writing about the death of the millennial left, which I associate with a kind of mourning of that illusion. On the other hand, I think we also have to say maps were never great. And I think maps were never great is kind of like the conservative illusion, let's say, or like you could say maybe it has happened, or maybe it's happening, or maybe it's yet to happen, but it's kind of like the death of the millennial right would be something like maps were never great, right? Something like that. But that brings us to, you know, throughout the book, you've got these 8 different variations on maps, let's say 8 different themes of maps. So you've got map, you know, I won't go through, we'll try and get through them all. I want to start with the first one is map naturing. I'm thinking about this and we can connect this. This is our nature is to make maps.
Yep.
Now, one of the themes in the map natures is the idea of the mono theory, right? You could say the mono theory is, for example, trying to spin a web where we catch all the others into our web and we have our perfect coherence with the mono theory. Now, the idea I was working through when reading through this is basically that in order to accept our map natures and in order to rise to the occasion of our map natures, in many ways, this forces dialectical thought. It's almost like dialectics is the correct response to our map natures. And perhaps this has a mode in classical thought, of course, Plato's dialogues, dialectic, also Hegel's thought, modern dialectics, and how these work. I was also trying to work through this theopolitically. So I was trying to think how, let's say, conservative Christians and communistic atheists could be non-dialectical totalizing maps, right? Like you say, Christian conservative totalizing map nature, and then you could have a communist atheist as another map totalization, right? Which will lead you into a certain web of catching flies. And it made me think that Zizek's performativity here is super interesting because you have the concept of Christian atheism, which short circuits both, and you have conservative communist, which short circuits both. And I'm trying to think, if we're thinking theopolitically with our map natures, and we're accepting we must think dialectically, in that chance, the struggle is how do we go from these completely coherent worldviews to being capable of dialectical thought, which can unify the opposites in a way that we're not identifying with them so much as we're using them to weave with others. And what I mean by that is that if I can learn how to think both from a perspective of a Christian and an atheist, if I can learn to think from the perspective of a conservative and a communist, then I can weave in situations where I'm dealing with Christians or atheists, or I'm dealing with conservatives or communists, right? So it's kind of like a practical dialectical training ground. So that's kind of what I was trying to think through there. So any thoughts you have about that would be great.
Absolutely fantastic. And yes, ultimately, it will mean all of this will mean dialectical thinking. And then the speculative reason that comes with that necessarily from the dialectical posture. Before I forget, what's also very critical between the distinction between the age of Gibbons and the age of maps is it is literally not possible to go back to Gibbons. It's not. If you go back to Gibbons, you're actually going back to indestructible maps that you think are Gibbons because they practically function the same. This is a very important point. Like, there's a lot of, like, so even if, and I think they were right, actually, this is very important. That's why the paper, The Truism, The Rational is there, and the deconstructing of common life and the whole common life. The Scottish Enlightenment, the counter-Enlightenment people, they're right that autonomous rationality leads to a code called the barbaricism of refinement that basically destroys everything because rationality is looking for it can always find that you lack axiomatic grounding for your views, your tradition, your culture, for whatever, and therefore give reason not to do them anymore. And basically, what the Hume notably is saying is, if you do that, people go nuts, and when they go nuts, they tend to go to war, and you have an unleashing of violence. And then, worse yet, someone can use this unbound rationality to establish a philosophical principle like freedom, democracy, justice, whatever, to create the possibility of total war, which was new in history, because up to that point, you could only convince people basically to go to war if it would give them food, if it would give them practical things. And Bernard de Juvenel on Power talks about this. There's a number of people in those fields that talk about that. And all of them are saying, if you destroy Givens, we're in trouble. They were right. And we were in trouble. The 20th century shows that. Modern war, all of those different things. It's there. We didn't get ourselves killed in the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I always go back to as radical contingency, that created the effect that the removal of Givens was a good idea. And in fact, the removal of Givens is necessary for global pluralism, etc., so forth. So it's necessary for getting the average person, the great enrichment, the great prosperity. McCloskey talks about all these different people required the loss of Givens. And I like running water and all the things technology has brought, right? So, they're pretty grand. And I actually do think often, this would be another topic, I'm not sure if people always understand how difficult and miserable life could be before the Great Enrichment. Life was pretty freaking terrible for a lot of people. The ones who aren't recorded in history, though. That's the problem. Like, when you read history, you're going to probably be hearing more about the heroes and the kings and the people in the courts, which can create an impression. Average life for many, many people was incredibly difficult. One can read Orwell's Wicked Peer, like, the jungle, all of these different things. We have to take that very, very seriously. But I think there's a romanticism that can lose sight of that, right? But nevertheless, the loss of Givens opens up the possibility of total war in all of these different problems, right? Well, the issue is Givens are gone now. Like, you cannot go back to Givens. So even if there's truth to the account of the counter-enlightenment, if you try to go back to Givens, which people are right now doing all over the internet in all of our political forms, what you're actually doing is finding internally consistent maps that are practically like Givens, that create the effect of a return to Givens, but actually it is an indestructible map, which is different than a given. The indestructible map seems like it's the same because practically it is, but technically it is not, and the difference is very important because it cannot function as an address of globalism. It will just feel like an existential stability, which feels like an address to your problems, but you're just returning to the pre-20th century to recreate the conditions of, total war and all the things that happened in the 20th century, right? And if you simply go, well, war is too bad to happen now. Look at the drones. Look at what's going on. No, it isn't. It is until it isn't. That's where you need to read books like The Guns of August. You need to read Game Theory and so on and so forth. So the first thing I just wanted to say before the important point you're making about dialectical thinking is that it is not possible to return to Givens. What people are doing when they think they are is finding an indestructible map. That's what they're doing. And that simply is that will ultimately, to say something large, all that's going to do is create a bunch of small fascist states. That's what it's going to do. Now, by the word fascist, it's also problematic that we can't see this because we conflate fascist with Nazi, and so we don't know what fascism is, and that also helps us not identify the political movement that is occurring because it is not flagrantly Nazi, and therefore we don't think it's fascist. We don't know what fascism is. And to say something large, fascism... A key characteristic of fascism is it is a political identity and operation based on a limited non-rational principle that organizes rationality, but for an exclusive group of people. Like, it's not going to apply to everyone. It will work for the people who share this non-rationality, say whiteness, or this geography, or this religion. It will work for them, but it doesn't work for people outside who will then have to form their own fascist state that has a non-rational principle. And now you'll say, well, that's decentralization. Oh, well, that's why we shouldn't make decentralization a magical word, right? And we actually need to review the American Civil War, the English Civil War, to see that decentralization is not a magic It's not a magic address. It's the pendulum swinging between decentralization and centralization over and over again until the ethical real, to allude to Lacan in a funny way, starts breaking through, right? So you're ultimately, and then of course the other key characteristic of fascism is that there's still a market. It's that the market just gets government support, right? There is like this is also important because the logic of capital, therefore, is perfectly fine with fascism. This is very important. Capitalism, you could argue, actually loves fascism because the free market then gets the support of the state, actually. The winners prevail in its indestructibility. The most rational thing that a corporation can do in the free market is become indestructible. And you know how you do that? Getting the government to pick you as a national champion, like they talk about in China, because the Chinese market is more fascist than communist. Now, I'd have to explain that, but it is, right? So the logic of capital is perfectly fine with fascism. In fact, the winners of that capitalism, that's the most rational form of capitalism for the winners of that market structure. And that's starting to get into techno-feudalism and all of those different things. So we're seeing this. The reason why this book, The Map is Indestructible, for me is important is because it is trying to describe what people are doing when they think they're returning to Gibbons. What do they think is going on? They're finding indestructible maps. But then, here's the problem. Indestructible maps are freaking indestructible. So you could argue it's almost worse than Gibbons, because at least Gibbons fall apart when you think about them. Indestructible maps, they don't fall apart when you think about them, because the consistency can absorb your rationality. It can make it work. This is the issue. There is something about indestructible maps that are actually more powerful than Gibbons. Because Gibbons, you can look for the axiomatic basis of them and can't find it, and then they fall apart. But a map is precisely that of which is internally consistent, taking into account its incompleteness. So identifying its incompleteness, its inability to axiomatically ground itself, doesn't destroy it, like it destroys Gibbons. So isn't that perfect? Isn't that exactly the perfect address of the loss of Gibbons? We've done it. We found indestructible maps. We don't have to worry about the problem of Gibbons anymore. Yeah, that's why it's such a vast temptation. That's why it's such an incredibly dire temptation that people are falling into all over the place, because it feels like the address, but it's the address of fascism. So this is the issue. The only way to deal with it, I've said a lot and haven't gotten to your question, but your question is basically huge, is that we have to choose dialectical thinking. But dialectical thinking will feel like, for many people, giving up the address to the loss of Gibbons, because it will feel like they found the address in indestructible maps, and we're like, well, that's actually going to lead to great horror and global pluralism. We need to give that up. That's going to be very hard on people, because you're asking them to return to the anxiety. So another reason for this book, and honestly this thinking, is for me to try to get out ahead before the problem of internally consistence continues to spread and grow. And like, this sounds very odd. You know, people talk about the meaning crisis, and we talked about it before, and there's benefits to that framing and problems to that framing. But as long as there's a meaning crisis, the map is indestructible problem has not entirely spread, because there are people who have not found indestructible maps to reestablish. That's where they're dealing with the nihilism and hopelessness, which actually is easier to move a person from that into dialectical thinking than it might be to move a person in an indestructible map into dialectical thinking. That's really, and that's where, like, Belonging Again Part 1 will say, the meaning crisis is a sign of hope, because that means people are not giving over to pre-modern ways of finding meaning, or they're holding themselves up to a higher standard. Because you can find meaning in nationalism or racism, or you can find meaning in these kind of cutting off from the other, right? That's the problem. So the meaning crisis, if we just use that, or bad nihilism, there are different languages, that's actually, the very existence of that can actually be, in a sense, tilled soil that makes the introduction of dialectical thinking easier, versus once you have people in indestructible maps, which more and more people are doing, and the internet accelerates the spread of, potentially, the ground can harden again, and it can become more difficult, right? And so this is why even things that seem obviously bad, quote unquote, like the meaning crisis, are not just bad. They entail actually some good in it, because it means people are open to things potentially they otherwise would not. So that's kind of, in a sense, to dialecticize the meaning crisis too, or nihilism, or so on and so forth, right? So I will pause there, because there was a lot, but I will move to the question whenever you like on the map naturing, because ultimately that section is getting at, it is in our nature to make maps. It is in our nature, naturally. We don't even have to think about it. If we don't think about it, we create internally consistent systems. If we don't think about thinking, we create maps. That it's in our nature because that's the only way to handle the real, you could say. The only way to make life intelligible is to make maps. The first thing, we create monotheories instead of polytheories, theories of everything that into which everything fit. We create social scripts so that we don't have to think about our interaction, and we use judgment instead of assessment to define what people are so that we can other them. We don't want to say a person lied, we want to say they are a liar, therefore to essentialize them and push them away. That's a very quick overview. And theoretical awareness as the opening paper is necessary because we're trying to say that there is no such thing as pure observation. If you have science is always going to be through a theoretical framework. Every theory is through a framework that is subjectively established. And then, of course, the funny move of the paper is theories cannot be about people who are aware of the theory in the theory itself. So there's an incompleteness there, right? Like, if you're telling everyone about the Milgram experiment, to use that famous example, that experiment can't be about people who know about the Milgram experiment. But once the theory is out, then we don't actually know if the theory still applies for people who know about the theory, right? So then is the theory a failure? There's this theoretical awareness occurs in the spread that creates an incompleteness principle that we try to cover up by actually denying the subjective element and treating the theory as something as a pure objectivity. So those were a lot of different points, but I'll throw it at you.
Well, I'm just going to sort of frame for the viewers that this theme that you're introducing about the impossibility of the return to givens and the possibility that what's actually going on there is the discovery of an indestructible map. Is that better or worse? I think this is a key thing we need to think through. I think that, of course, with the age of givens, you have the thoughtlessness and the of course, you have the collective impoverishment of most people. I think with the indestructible maps, this is being unleashed precisely because we're forced to think about our thinking in a way, and perhaps people stop themselves short of really following through with what that entails, and what that requires of the subject. People perhaps are going towards intellectual comfort over the arduous, let's say, labor of the negative, or tarrying with the negative or something like that. I think the key weakness that you point out in your book, and we're not there yet, of course, but I think that this is just sort of, as it were, foregrounding something that I think is important that you get to in the book, is that the problem with the indestructible map in and of itself, as distinct from the age of givens, is that it leads to an endless division,
Yes.
meaning a kind of map proliferation.
Yes.
It leads to a psychotic society. It's
Yes.
That's the dominant thing it seems to lead to me, is to a psychotic society.
Yes.
So there's a whole outlining of a struggle in your work that seems to me to point towards the necessity of map drive in order to map situate. And if we can't map drive to map situate, then we fall into these totalizing maps, which end up proliferating in an unreflective way. And I do think that that is happening today, and I think you're right, and I think that it's so crucial to link this to the phenomenon of fascism, as what will be the main result of this. And I think where we do need a kind of death of the millennial right, in some sense, if this is to not happen or if to stop happening. But I just want to outline kind of how I've been reading the logic and how I see it appearing on the horizon. I've been studying it through the lens of actually people are using, now this is more right-leaning people, are using the logic of Israel to justify the spread of many Israels. What I mean by that is they say that Israel is a Jewish theopolitical state. It's based on ethnic lines, and it's based on a weird combination between ethnicity and religion. And they say, fine, great, Israel should exist. Israel has a right to exist. Israel should continue existing on the basis that we can do that in England, on the basis that we can do that in America, basically on the basis that England can become, let's say, a white Christian ethno-state, or on the basis that America can become a white Christian ethno-state or something. Basically, you're universalizing the logic of these small-scale fascisms in order to not deal with the logic of capital, or as in, I think, most of your work, you'll say the situation of capital, and not align map drive to the situation of capital, but rather to think you're reinstituting givens, but what you're really doing is creating these indestructible maps, which are leading to this endless internal division, which you're not able to think this endless internal division because you've kind of put yourself into a psychotic state.
Exactly.
So there will be all these internal wars internal to the white ethno-states. Those internal antagonisms will appear, and they will destroy the foundations of those enclosures, but they won't be able to think themselves in that way. And also the alignment here with the logic of capital is that many of them are looking precisely for billionaires who can support their markets. Like you're saying, so now they're looking for billionaires to support their markets, right? Meaning, can we build white institutions, white communities, white, and so forth. And so you get the logic of capital aligning to this kind of racial identity. So I just want to say that is actually happening. So this thought is really, really important. And then if you can, I'll just throw it out as a link if you want to talk about map natures and the importance of dialectics on the one hand. And then you've already presenced the role of eschatology. So I want to put here the map natures as the first section. Then you have the map ceiling, which is the second section. So you have the map natures. If we're not dialectical, we're going to spin our maps. Then because the rationality can't close in on itself, it's going to use a non-rational point of reference to seal itself. And this can happen, of course. A Christian can just say, for example, Jesus is coming back. But also a communist can say, well, we're going to overthrow capitalism. Right? So, and a transhumanist can say, well, the post-human's coming and I'm going to be part of the post-human. Maybe I'll be uploaded. So there's many different ways in which this map sealing can occur. What you crucially say is that the limit of the subject, the negative of the subject, appears on the level of death and apocalypse. So we mobilize death, we mobilize apocalypse as a non-rational kernel towards the sealing of our maps. Now I want to say two things of how this appears on our horizon before throwing it back to you, is that on the one hand, you could think about an interconnected web of commons problems as kind of like pointing towards an apocalypse. Global warming, inequality, mass migration, artificial intelligence, so forth. And then there are other ways in which people can say polycrisis and metacrisis. So the polycrisis and the metacrisis can just be a catch-all for some looming apocalypse, which will surely destroy us all unless we think in a certain way, unless we, all get on board with this sort of worldview or paradigm or, web of thought. So a lot there, but I'll throw out the map natures problem and the map ceiling problem. Maybe you could do something with that.
No, fantastic. And what you said about the spuriousness of the division, that's exactly right. Basically, if we don't think maps, if we don't think thought, we can't have any possibility of a true infinity. We're just going to fall into various spurious infinities. And as you divide up, the probability of conflict, misunderstanding, etc., so forth, skyrocket. And it's basically inevitable, because if you divide up precisely with a logic that others the other, then why, when inevitably there is the encounter of the other, why would you abandon that logic at that point to make space for the other? It would go against the very principle by which you did the original spurious development, right? And so you conflict and the spurious go together very, very powerfully. And then as you get that spuriousness, here's the other thing: global coordination becomes unbearable. Like the trade agreements that have to be made, the military bases that are established, the coordination of the globe becomes infinitely more complex, to the point where that creates, black swans. Black swans skyrocket as you increase spuriousness, as well as you divide up, right? Those are other things that need to be discussed. But as you divide, the likelihood of something unexpected occurring that leads to catastrophe skyrockets, right? But then the problem is with a totalization, like a global totalization, is you may not get the ultra catastrophe, you just get the, what T.S. Eliot said, the whimper. You don't get a bang, but you get this slow descent into mediocrity where everyone is just kind of nihilistically going through the motions of capital and they are kind of strangled, right? So then the response to, well, we don't want to be strangled. We'd rather go out with a bang than a whimper, responding to Eliot's Hollow Man. Well, you'll get your bang, and then you'll realize how terrible it was. You run off to World War I excited, and then when you get into the trenches, the terror sets in, and that just keeps repeating over and over again. So we're caught between totalization projects or centralization projects and spurious projects that keep responding to one another, that eventually are going to lead to greater and greater and greater scales of catastrophe, unless we can establish a linking to Hegel, something that's more of a true infinity than something spurious, which is able to have the universal and the singular together, which of course is the great difficulty, but actually very, very important to think. I will also note, thoughtless dialect. Here's the issue. If you don't think dialectics, what Korbowski and Hegel and all these people are pointing out is that reality is dialectical in the sense that it's passing over into otherness. It always has a development that is occurring, like the embryo, the seed, it's developing, right? So if you don't think dialectically, what that means is you're in a reality, you are thoughtlessly dialectical. You are in a dialectical reality that you don't think of. That always becomes fascist. It always becomes fascist because you necessarily are reliant on some non-rational principle for the movement of that development that will more and more unveil itself with time, that you're just going to have to own as it unveils itself, and even proudly own it. And then once you do that, you have the fascist, but well, we're white. Yeah, man, it's great to be white. And then boom, you own it, and then you seal it and say, and if we don't do this, the nation's destroyed. And now you have the sealing going on, right? You're sealing it. You're creating the death is the event horizon of reason essay is what you start alluding to, right? So if you don't think about dialectics, you're still dialectically operating the world without thinking about it. And what ends up happening, eventually the non-rational necessity emerges. And when it does, you either have to own it or realize that you were brought to a place you're not ready of. And most people aren't going to do that. They're not going to suffer the subjective destitution of realizing that their good ideas won't save them. Most people will just own a non-rational principle of, say, a national Christian identity or race or technology, and then own it and be proud of it and just explicitly identify it and go from there. And that will still be rational, though, because they will make it the point of incompleteness that does not disprove their map. So for example, when you come to the point where you say, well, what we need is for everyone to be a Christian nationalist, well, if the world has not come into existence where everyone is a Christian nationalist. So you can say, we don't know that it won't work, to say this is simplistic how it works, but you can say, well, you don't know it won't work, and so there is reason to keep trying and to bring it about. And of course, once it occurs, if it doesn't work, you can always say, well, it's because people didn't do it right. These people gave up at the last minute. You can start scapegoating, and this is what we see in every utopian political project, right? There's we don't know it won't work. Then when you get it and it doesn't work, you blame people within the organization or an outside other, and you never, ever, ever have to abandon the utopian project because you can always come up with reasons that are plausible for why it didn't work, and thus never overturn the consistency of the utopian project itself, right? A key way that people do this is, so we have, we've already mentioned this idea of, say, making the eschatology the point of incompleteness that is not in the map that makes the mapping indestructible. It is in and not in the map at the same point. It's this point of that of which is yet to occur, that the map's consistency is contingent on, that makes it indestructible because it can't occur, or it won't occur, or if it occurs, it would be the apocalypse. So the other move to the eschatology is, like you mentioned, global warming. In death is the event horizon of reason, it's the idea, the formula is you can never allow in the act of thinking a formula that says if X doesn't do Y, X doesn't exist, therefore Y. There's actually no thinking in that, because if X doesn't do Y, X is gone, therefore we have to do Y. Many people today who are not, explicitly, say, white nationalists or something like that, nevertheless are creating internally consistent systems like maps by having a logic based on a death principle. Like the polycrat. If we don't get rid of fossil fuels, the world will end because of global warming, right? Well, we have to do it then, right? And there's nothing to argue, actually. It must be done. If you say, well, there's this polycrisis coming, and so we have to, institute game B, or something and get rid of competitive dynamics, well, then we have to do it, right? There's no choice because we're all going to die, right? So there actually is no debate because you're employing a formula that says if it doesn't occur, the game is over. This is another means of basically making an indestructible map. An indestructible map creates necessity. There's no contingency anymore. It's necessary, right? So it must be done. So likewise, if you say Jesus, there's going to be a second coming, well, it's necessary to change your life now in a manner to prepare for it because you don't want to be judged or something, right? So there's a necessity that indestructibility brings with it. Whereas dialectical thinking is fundamentally a certain consideration of contingency. So that's very opposed to this sort of necessity that is in operation. Another way that the paper based on missing axioms, Samuel Barnes' wonderful book, Missing Axioms, and he also has the Iconoclast, and I appreciate Mr. Barnes a lot. And on this idea of the truth is veiled in blood, one of the key ways that people make their map indestructible is martyrs and soldiers. Like if these people died in World War II to create the world, the Washington Consensus, the neoliberalism, that is a term that's a little squishy in what it means, but people use it, then how could you ever question the Washington Consensus? Because all of these people that have died, right? There's an idea, and if you don't honor these people, there's a way in which you are invalidated as a subject. It undermines you, like you lack honor, right? And so by making the justification of a worldview or a map someone's blood or blood that was spilt or something like that, it becomes untouchable, right? It becomes kind of unimaginable, right? So like, for example, this can also be why, various governments have actually perhaps incentive to send people to war, because then how could you ever question the government if those people died for that activity? Wouldn't you be undermining their sacrifices, right? So that creates a way to not question the internally consistent system, right? And then, of course, there's that essay on the game theory on why many conversations are bad and democracy likely doomed. There are ways people carry themselves in conversation to employ dominant strategies to make sure that their map is sealed, that it is never unveiled as contingent, that it maintains its certain necessity. We can go into detail on all of those, but it follows, the point would be this, and then I'll give it to you. We have a nature to create maps, as we must to make life intelligible. It only then follows that we want to employ strategies to seal those maps so that they're secure, and also so that we ourselves don't want to experience our maps as primarily maps. We want to experience them as isness, right? We just want to experience them as the case. And the critical move is after Gddel, even if we know the map is not the territory, that is precisely part of the territory, because the territory itself consists of incompleteness, so that realization actually isn't enough to unseal our maps. That's that really tricky move where after Gddel, maps are actually stronger thanks to incompleteness, not weaker, which again, we can go into. But the idea is if we have a map nature, it is then only rational for us to employ strategy of sealing those maps, to securing them, to making them including everything that needs to be thought and that we need to do. And a way you seal them is by basically cutting off possibility. If we don't do game bay and the world's going to end, then you're saying you're cutting off possibilities of doing something other than game B or other than getting rid of fossil fuels. You're shutting down possibilities, right? Which then creates a feeling of necessity. If you say, well, we can't think neoliberalism and the problems of capitalism because of the world wars that made it possible, and it would be forsaking and dishonoring people who died in those wars, etc., so forth, then you're closing off the possibility of rethinking the current moment that has followed from, say, the world wars or things like that, right? And if you don't allow in conversation to go in a manner that arises to possibilities because you shut it down with pragmatism, dominant strategies, and other things, then you're not encountering possibility, and thus your map is sealed. Like, there's less introduction into the map of possibilities beyond it, and therefore it seals off. And thus, in the same motion, you're shutting down the possibility of dialectical thinking. So that's the next move that occurs. But I'll pause and give it to you. And I will know, I meant to say this. I really like that idea of weaving with others versus webs to catch flies. I think that's a useful framing. But let me give it to you.
Well, I want to there's two hard things. One of the hard things that I was thinking about while reading the book, especially as it relates to map sealing, is knowing the difference between using a certain negativity, apocalypse, death in order to reify your own reason versus recognizing that there are real threats and catastrophes,
Yeah.
right? And how do you walk that line between using a certain negativity, like, for example, global warming, economic inequality, social migration, technological singularity? How do you know whether you're using that in order to just reify a certain coherent framework that you think is particularly important versus actually building the, say, dialectical conversational spaces where real challenges and real possible global threats are discussed and debated and reflected upon. And it becomes increasingly difficult with whatever we call the poly crisis or the meta crisis or the commons problems to know which threat takes priority because they're so overlapping. And you can easily tell that certain people have a preference for one crisis over another. Like, for example, when you're in a group that clearly thinks that global warming is the biggest challenge, versus when you're with a group who clearly thinks economic inequality is the biggest challenge, versus when you're in a group that clearly thinks social migration is the biggest challenge, versus a group where you're saying clearly technological singularity is the biggest challenge. How do you think about all these things, the way they overlap, the way they can be mobilized ideologically, and so forth and so on? This is like a mega challenge, right?
I,
Then the other, yeah, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead. Do you want to
I'm
respond to that?
sorry. That is such a huge issue. I'll just quickly say that problem is massive. How do you tell the difference
Yeah,
between the negativity that is shutting down versus the negativity that
yeah.
needs to be faced for the opening up? I think generally, first, as just a few, do you enjoy the negativity? Is there an enjoyment in the discussion of the negativity? That's a bad sign. Second, is the negativity clearly, obviously the one to be focused on? And if people are not focused on that, they're stupid. Well, then that's probably a problem because you're using it in terms of identification, as Korbosky warns against, versus dialecticizing. Like, the lack of dialectics is also another key. Also, to say, and then I'll give it to you, and forgive me for interrupting, is that
That's
this is
why
one of
the
is everything.
dialectical map natures helps us deal with the map ceiling.
Yes, it does. This is the key. The key, because there's a lot of, honestly, admittedly weird moves in the book, which is this thing that incompleteness actually creates indestructibility. But there's also where the very incompleteness of maps from a different angle actually opens up the dialectics. But from another angle, it closes dialectics. It depends on how you absolutely choose to relate to it, because the Gddel point itself won't tell you the right way to relate to it. You have to decide, because how to treat the Gddel point by definition is not included in the map. It is the necessary point that all maps consist of, because completeness is impossible, that then you choose how you relate to. But then why would you choose X instead of Y if you don't have a map to tell you which one to choose? Why would you choose one versus the other? And this opens up a abyssalness that has to be very seriously tarried with. And more needs to be said. That's a giant thing. But if in your negativity, I'm of the opinion that basically all of these negativities is going to be really tied to the capacity of the subject to handle becoming other and otherness and dialectical thinking. Like, all of these, sometimes people make a distinction between the polycrisis and the meta crisis. The polycrisis being all the mini crisis, and the meta crisis being the underlying crisis that is coming out in all of these different forms. I heard that framing recently from Life Itself, which Jacob Kashir was hosting podcasts of, and I've really enjoyed him and Matthew in the portal. This has been wonderful. But this idea, I kind of like that, because I'll emphasize, and we talk all the time about AA versus AB. There is something about the meta crisis being the movement from AA to AB, the ability to become other, becoming alien, to work as the Nietzschean spirit child, to actually take seriously absolute knowing, which then the issue is, that would be the ability of the subject to handle becoming other. So what this would also mean is that if in your taking seriously negativity, there is a removement of otherness, there is not a you confronting your own negativity, these would all be evidences that the difference is this: you've placed negativity outside of yourself versus in you. And I think that's kind of the key difference, honestly. Like, a lot of times, negativity that is actually problematic is outside of you. You know that global warming is a problem, and you know what you need to address. It's just that we got to convince these other people who don't get it, right? The negativity is not intimate with yourself. It has been externalized, right? Like, that's often what occurs with polycrisis considerations. The negativity is outside. If that is the negativity you're talking about, it is very highly likely in the business of map sealing. If you have externalized the negativity to a problem, here's the other key, this is later in the book. If you've made the negativity a problem you can solve versus a problem you have to manage, it is likely in the business of map sealing. But if it is a negativity that is always with you, that have to always be managed, then it is almost by definition intimate with the subject themselves, therefore intimate with you. Therefore, it is likely the real negativity that has to be faced to actually open us up in the waves that are being described. But of course, the tricky move to this is basically what this is saying too, is that everything that needs to be thought, there's a counterfeit of. There is some simulacra of. We need to face negativity, but there's a form of negativity that is actually avoiding negativity. We need to take seriously, I'll talk all the time about things like beauty, but there's a form of beauty that actually functions to serve fascism and identity, right? Like there's always a counterfeit of something that we need to do. And one of the problems is that maps are insanely good at creating counterfeits of what we need to take seriously. They, like another example that James Hunter talks about is maps turn pluralism into multiculturalism. Multiculturalism seems like pluralism, but the idea of multiculturalism is, yes, we all have different holidays, different clothing, different tastes, but in the end, we're all the same humanity. We're all the same, which is the idea that, we're not deeply different. There's difference, but not deep different, right? That's a counterfeit and has been very destructive. But it's like pluralism, and I think that's also another key. I think if you're dealing with real negativity, versus map sealing negativity, you are aware of the counterfeit version of that negativity. There is an awareness of the form of that negativity that is actually in service of the avoidance of the negativity. You have a sense of the counterfeit potential, and you're trying to keep your eye on the ball. Well, actually, I'll say that, and then I'll get to you, is that a negativity that is likely in the business of map sealing is one you don't have to pay constant, diligent attention to. It has no slippage quality. Like, real negativities have this way of hiding, this way of getting away, or being rationalized, or slipping out of focus at the last minute, because you as the subject don't want to see them. You'd have to change, right? This constant present negativity, like global warming, that's dangerous because it doesn't have slippage. It's very constant. It can easily organize action, or limiting immigration because they're destroying the country. This negativity has this constancy to it. It's regularly there. But the negativities that we really have to work for have this way of vanishing in front of you because you forget them, because they unveil that, you think you're a nice person, but you actually get angry easier. Oh, you think you know what to do, but it's actually just your good ideas that you constantly keep, creating idols out of, right? So that's another difference, is this negativity that's constantly in front of you and thus provides stable guidance and thus is like a given. People, like a negativity that is practically like a given is a map, almost by definition. But negativities that don't allow you to create direction or givens easily, they force you to instead be prepared for the surprise or open to the unexpected. That tends to be qualities of the negativity we need to take seriously. So those thoughts come to mind.
Well, I can link that concretely to the other hard thing I wanted to bring up, which is, on the one hand, using blood for justification and reifying a certain game versus avoiding getting bloody at all, not having any skin in the game. And I think that that's also something to pay attention to, because obviously we've used already examples of fascist examples where you're kind of using blood for a justification for human relationality. It's not like you're actually learning how to relate to humans. You're just using certain blood metaphor as a stand-in for human relationality in a way. Versus there's also people who avoid getting bloody at all, and they have a very disembodied existence, and they don't have any skin in the game, and so then they can just operate as if they're, with no risk, basically. So I actually think that the example I was thinking about while reading the section on map sealing was marriage, because we think about marriage, well, you have skin in the game, and you're sort of building with blood in a way. But you also, in order to actually have a good marriage, you need to work with little negativities, like you're saying. It's not like this global warming thing, but it's more things that you might not want to look at, right? There's a way in which the intimate other brings you to look at things that you might not want to look at. So there's a way in which you can sort of, you know, build your map with blood, but not in a way that you're sort of trying to scapegoat someone or you're trying to avoid real human relationality. So I wanted to bring that up. And then maybe before throwing it back to you, I just want to frame for people the map natures, the map ceiling leads into the map vanishing. And I really think it's good the way you talk about how we want to, as it were, disappear into our maps as if we were disappearing into isness,
Yes.
like as if we were actually corresponding to what is, as if we were corresponding to the situation, but we're actually not. We're just vanishing into our map. And I also want to presence as sort of like a question or a challenge or a problematic to you is, and the way you frame in the book, that one of the problems with map vanishing today is precisely what you're presencing with global pluralism, because it's kind of like a forcing function that makes it difficult for maps to vanish because you're constantly actually encountering maps that contradict your map, maps that are different than your map, maps that make your map impossible to stand on their own two legs, so to speak. So I want to connect that to what you were saying with actually the illusion of, say, liberal pluralism was that we're not deeply different, that we're only superficially different. So we have our, we eat our different foods, we have our different customs, we have our different rituals and religions, but we can all, as it were, coexist equally in a sort of global melting pot. As opposed to the idea that no, we're actually deeply different, and these differences are so different that we recoil against them in horror and we try to self-insulate and self-enclose. And I think that's where we're encountering now the breakdown of the global pluralism into the regional fascisms. And how do we think through that tension? Which is where we'll have people vanishing into their maps, into their self-enclosed communities.
No, outstandingly put. And the blood question is fantastic because one of the things is that there's a way in which the only way to actually treat negativity properly, to move toward the spirit child, we could say, is with the sweat and blood of our lives, right? As we talked about, the hard road, right? So the issue is, we thus want to, so this is the weird thing. Everything we need to do to increase the probability we can avoid doing it, we need to include it in our map in the wrong way. Because that is where we can tell, no, we take blood seriously. We take negativity seriously. Absolutely. Oh, yeah, of course, Dan, Gddel, negativity, that's really important. I don't deny that. Global warming. We got to stop the liberals. We got to, we take negativity. There's a lot of hard things, right? Oh, yeah, blood is really important. That's exactly right. That's why, we have Jesus died on the cross. It's by his blood that we're saved, and therefore the second coming. Like, we're going to, or the blood of the conflict. Like, the key is that we have to take the things that are actually necessary for the movement into dialectical thinking and include them in our map in the wrong way. If we did not, then we would be at risk of the experience of, say, blood forcing us to encounter the real, right? So we kind of preempt it, right? By having an understanding of blood that doesn't make it a, say, revelation of the need to encounter the real, right? And so one of the ways we do it is by having the function of blood in our world being, say, in the form of the martyr, the soldier, the people that died for this nation, our bloodline, our family line. We have blood and the importance of blood and, working hard, sacrifice, go to your mark, go to your job, take care of your family. There's a sacrifice logic that is going on, right? And all of this, like a key way that the logic of capital does not get questioned is the idea that to question it is to draw, couldn't you be suggesting that all the people working 9 to 5s to take care of their family, there's a kind of lack of honor in it? Like, one of the ways people get up in the morning is believing that what they're doing is noble, right? That there's a nobility in it. If you start questioning the logic of capital, aren't you drawing their nobility into question? And people tend to take that very personally, right? This idea that I poured my sweat and blood into these things. So then blood comes to actually function in the system in a manner to seal it, as opposed to actually us shedding blood in a manner that actually is the facing of negativity that opens us up at the Gddel point to the other, right? And so that's the really tricky moves that I think are really important to identify, because what it ultimately means is just thinking blood or thinking sweat. That alone is not necessarily enough to move you into the negativity necessary for the development of dialectical thinking of the spirit child, if it is not done with thought of the entire situation. Like, this would get again to the Korobowski. Like, if all you're doing is identifying the variable of negativity in your thinking, or the variable of blood, that actually could just contribute to the indestructibility of your map. Right? Because you're saying, yeah, I am facing negativity. I go to a job I hate, and I'm working 9 to 5 to take care of things. I know all about negativity, right? But that actually is sealing the system that in place, right? You have to think about the entire situation. Okay, yes, blood and sweat and negativity are important, but how are those variables functioning in the entire situation of the moment, or the entire situation of the world? That's where Korobowski is like, if we're not thinking situation, we're not thinking at all, and actually we're setting up the conditions of being manipulated, going crazy, losing sanity, being taken advantage of, because all you're doing is identifying things, not asking the logic of the entire situation in which they are operating in. And I think that's what's so tricky here, is like you say, there's a form of, negativity that is necessary to think, and then there's a form of it that map seals. There is a form of thinking blood that is necessary to think, but then there's another form of it that contributes to fascism and sealing, right? And we have to see the entire operation at play. But of course, the brain doesn't want to think the entire operation at play, because that uses energy. Rather, it would just follow the map one step at a time. We want an entire map that we follow one step at a time, not thinking the entire interplay of how maps shield us from the real, help us deal with negativity in a manner that doesn't overwhelm us. We don't want to think all that. We just want to do the next step, the next step, the next phase, identify what we need to do next, and thus you're kind of just stuck in the consistency of your map. I think also in this idea of the map vanishing and its relation to global pluralism, that is extremely well put, because there's this double move of saying, okay, maps want to once you seal a map, it then goes into the business of vanishing into isness. And we do that by changing how we describe others in a manner that makes them clearly stupid or clearly anti-American. We manage the things that we know and don't know, and how our emotions relate to those things, to keep them out of the periphery of encounter, or in a manner when we do encounter them, we can clearly identify them as good or bad. So let me put it this way. What ends up happening now is, let's say we have someone who is just a conservative in America. They turn on the TV and they see liberals in New York. Well, the way that they make the other fit into the map is saying, well, they're stupid. They're dumb, right? They basically, all maps set up a logic where the otherness you see in global pluralism needs to convert. There's a logic of conversion that is always in operation. So if you say, well, the liberal is stupid or they hate America, what you're saying is they need to convert to conservatism, right? If you are, the atheist who thinks religion is dumb, you are saying that people need to convert to atheists, or the religion who's saying that atheism is you're saying there's a conversion that needs to occur, right? So the way that maps tend to deal with the inevitable encounter of otherness in global pluralism is a conversion logic that is in operation. Conversion is a religious word, but actually it's all over the map. Like, if you have this idea of of rationality, what we need is for people to be more rational. What you're saying is people need to be converted by rationality into being more rational. They need to be converted into Marxism. They need to be converted into something, right? And so this is typically the way that people deal with the problem of encountering otherness, is by positioning the other as needing to be saved, needing to be converted, needing to be changed. And so what you're doing is fitting the difference into the logic of your map, to where the other doesn't draw into question the entire roots of your map, but simply, oh yeah, there are others, and that's a problem we need to fix. We need to convert them, right? Because even if you say something like, we need everyone to go to their national identities, you're saying you want to convert everyone into thinking that they just need to go into their national identities. Even those projects that have a logic of honoring difference, because this is why the fascist is such a difficult project, is because it seems to take difference seriously. It seems to be the only political project often that takes difference seriously. It's saying, yes, Whites are different from blacks and Asians and whatever. They're deeply different. So we need to create isolated political formulas. And one of the reasons fascism keeps coming back is because we haven't wanted to take difference deeply. But since difference is deep, that creates an opening for the fascism to return if people have not been thinking this problem ahead of time, or has not been thinking to be prepared for that return. And so it keeps coming back time and time and time again. So what ends up happening, you say, well, difference is deep, and therefore we're going to separate apart. But then you have the ever spuriousness that occurs, right? The ever splintering off that occurs, right? So what ends up happening is you have to understand you cannot let your map face the other or turn the other that you encounter in global pluralism into a need to convert. But of course, this opens the question of, well, then are we saying no one ever changes? What is the mechanism of change? And don't some people need to change in certain ways versus other? This gets into logic of Shine, many things of reconstructing A as A, which is the reconstruction of A as A that gets in more into the topic of faithful presence. I will stop there, although there's more to be said on, say, Wittgenstein's certainty deterrence, as I like to talk about in different things, but I'll stop there.
Well, I think that what I just want to presence for people where we are in the current conversation is, again, I think that, again, correct me if you don't want it to be read like this, but I read it to be that map natures, map sealing, and map vanishing kind of function as a triad that we need to be aware of, and they naturally lead into one another.
Yes.
And that this triad, it may be the way in which human beings have naturally operated throughout most of history, if not all of history.
Yeah.
But that global pluralism doesn't allow us to move forward with this strategy, that we have to become meta-dialectically aware of this triad, and we need to take on some of the other aspects of maps that you outline throughout the rest of the book, from the 4th section to the 8th section, which can give us sort of a deeper sense of the stakes of the contemporary challenge. And I'm not sure if we get, of course, it would be kind of perhaps an intellectual performative contradiction to say that we get a final solution or answer to our situation, but we at least start to outline the challenge in a way that we might be able to talk about it, reflect about it, and think about it more deeply. So I'll just say, moving from the way in which map vanishing runs into a kind of forcing function with global pluralism, you run into the section called map consistency, where I take the problem there with map consistency to be, one, maybe historically we have built external and internal models of consistency, but the real challenge is you're building up towards how do we become situationally consistent.
Yes.
And the best way, I think, to become situationally consistent, as far as I could tell from the book, is you want to build up a repetitive pattern, which is consistent, but you want to have that repetitive pattern be capable of withstanding shocks and surprise. If your repetitive pattern can't withstand shocks and surprise, then by definition you'll fall apart. But then the paradox emerges is, well, how do I build up a consistent repetitive pattern that can withstand shocks and surprises? By definition, shocks and surprises, I can't build them into their shocks and surprises.
Correct.
Right? So there's this challenge where you really come to face not the map, but the subject.
Yes.
And what type of subject do I need to be in order to engage in a consistent pattern, situationally speaking, which can withstand shocks and surprise? And the metaphor that I was thinking about in regards to this section was actually the role of a father. That, to me, the role of a father is a good thing to think through when it comes to situational consistency, because in regards to the situation of the father and the child when your child is young, if your father is dramatically inconsistent, you can't trust his pattern, you can't trust his speech, you can't trust his behavior, then you're basically going to have a nightmare as a child, because you need your father to be consistent. You need your father to be, at the same time, you don't want your father to be so consistent that there's no space for you to build your own way. Right? So on the one hand, you need your father to be consistent. On the other hand, your father can't be so consistent that he can't withstand the shock and the surprise of you. right? Because the child has to be a shock and the surprise to the father. So I thought that was a good model to think through consistency, but I'd be definitely open to how are you trying to approach it in the book itself, maybe examples that you use in the book itself, and we'll go from there.
No, I think that's a wonderful example. Because if you don't have consistency at all, then you have no pattern of direction, you have no sense of what to do, and you tend to be dysfunctional. And then you're going to tend to create on you're very likely you'll end up in perversion, where you're going to fall into some enjoyment that you find and enclose yourself in it by some sort of logic that maintains it. That can occur. You can also have people looking for a big other if their father didn't preside. So the father, if they do the right, this is the weird thing. The effective father provides a pattern without functioning as a big other, which of course, what does that look like? Well, it is a pattern that is going to ultimately be leading to a certain openness. Like it's a pattern that is leading to the failure of the pattern. It's like the problem of naming in Lacan. And, Edie has that wonderful work that he's been talking about. If you affect name too early, there's problems, right? You don't work through the effect, right? So you have to be careful to name something. But, and then you also talked about the problem of the name of the father. But then, of course, if there's no naming, there's no social order. Naming creates social intelligibility. We can't function without names. So how do you relate to the name in a manner that leads it to, that doesn't get in the way of the development that only occurs in the namelessness? Likewise, how does the father create the space where the child can develop in the way that can only occur in the absence of the father, right? And how does the child even end up in that space? Well, they need the pattern of the father to lead them to the space where there is no father, where they operate outside the father, right? Thanks to the father, which of course is a thrust of the Christian atheist theopolitical project. Something very, very similar applies to maps. Because there's a few things. The map consistency section is also going to make the argument, because there was this dream. And you could, this is the dream of autonomous rationality that a lot of the book is critiquing, is the idea, well, just get rid of maps. Just have pure observation. Don't have ideology. Just get rid of ideology. Just have facts. Just have the data. Just have science. Just have studies. Just have observation. Get rid of these things. Now, unfortunately, this has contributed to a strong reaction against science, which has been very bad, because that's just contributing to the autonomous non-rationality, which leads to madness. But then also, if you have this idea of science without the science of the subject, as you've put it, then you get trouble, right? So there's this idea of we don't need to take the science serious, we don't need to take the subject seriously, because we can just follow the data, I'll just say, right? Well, likewise, there's an idea of, well, it's okay, maps are a problem, so let's get rid of maps. Let's just figure out the territory and be done with it. This section wants to argue that that is impossible, because literally there's many reasons. Reality is fundamentally a situation. It is fundamentally, it is always already situated through a subjective framework to make it intelligible, right? Like if you say something is evidence, like if it is evidence, that means there is a case that it is evidence toward. So you are bringing something to the phenomenon to turn it into evidence that is not given by the phenomenon, right? That's how something is evidence, that you're bringing it into a framework, right? And likewise, there's the problem that we talk about here, where why does Ansell's ontological argument always haunt us? This argument is actually a revelation of the inescapability of maps and internally consistent systems, because the point that Ansel is making in the ontological argument is that he's like, God is that of which nothing greater can exist. A God that exists is greater than one that doesn't exist. Therefore, God exists. The key to this argument that Anselm is pointing, it is only if you believe God can you make the claim that God doesn't exist. Like you have to make this, you have to try to disprove God from your knees. You have to enter into theism in order to disprove the existence of God. Well, theism is that of which assumes God. So it is only from within the assumption of God that you can disprove God, and therefore it's an impossible endeavor, right? That's the key to the ontological argument that I think is not properly understood, because Anselm would just properly say, if you say, well, that God doesn't exist, he'd say, well, you're not thinking about God. The God that you think doesn't exist is not the God that does, and therefore the one you disprove is always the one that doesn't. And in order to get that, you have to move into the assumption of God's existence. But if you assume God's existence, then God's existence is an internally consistent system that you can never disprove. The same goes if you accept free market capitalism. Free market capitalism always has a response for why it's not working. It's because markets aren't free enough yet. It's because the corporations have replaced the small businesses. Marxism always has, you have to enter, and if you enter into Marxism and assume of state Marxism, not as Catrone means it, but as many people have typically meant it, is if you assume its axioms, then yeah, Marxism has not been disproven. And in fact, you could argue must never necessarily be disproven within its own internal consistency, right? So that's the problem of maps, because it can always create that situation of the problem of internally consistent systems, but we require maps to make sense of the world because you cannot have pure objectivity. Like, pure objectivity is not possible. It always has to be situated in a framework of interpreting it, and that must necessarily be a map. And reality itself is a situation. It is not pure identification, or what Korobowski would say, algebra. It is always being interpreted into a more geometrical form, right? Now, that geometrical form might be Lacan's geometrical forms, but if that is the case, then you have to incorporate the subject into your thinking about reality. And the moment you do that, you're talking about a map, not pure territory. So pure territory is not possible. Well, then we have to deal with maps. But if we're dealing with maps, we're dealing with all these problems of ideology that we've been discussing. Oh, crap. This is kind of the rub. Like, we've described all these problems that happen with maps, so then the temptation would be to say, well, get rid of maps then. And we're saying, no, that's not going to work. Because reality is necessarily mapped if it is intelligible. And so you have to somehow tarry with maps. Well, how the frick do you tarry with maps and not fall into all of the problems we've already described, right? You have to change your relation to what you're using the maps for. Likewise, you change your relationship to what the Father is for, what the Father is doing. Is the Father there to be a big other, or is the Father creating a pattern to lead you to the place outside the name of the Father? Are you have to use a map, but are you using that map to find, well, the Gddel point in which you can reside to relate to other maps, to relate to other people, so that you can actually hold all of the different maps together? Because you can only find the Gddel point, the point where consistency is unveiled not to be coherence, by being really good at your map. You have to be, like, really know your map. This is kind of the irony. The way you deal with the problem of maps is to really, really know it, precisely to get to a place where you know how to abandon it. That's really tricky. You put all this effort into learning your map, and you're doing all of that simply to get to the place where you can negate it? Yes, because not all negations are equal. And if you want it to be a negation of the negation, you have to do it well, which means you have to really freaking know it. So you're working really hard to know the point at the map where it fails, because it's where it fails that you can then have something in common with the people in different maps who also come to the place where it fails. And that becomes the point of reliability and intelligibility by which you can start dealing with global pluralism. If everyone used their map to find the point where the Gddel point is unveiled, that becomes a commonality possible in every possible map that can be beginning to work the issue of the universal and the singular together. Because everyone has a singularity must necessarily have a map, but the common principle is the fail point that can then be the relatability in singularity that provides the basis of a consistency. So I jumped ahead a lot there, but the section on map consistency is also pointing to simply the impossibility of not dealing with maps, which I think is the temptation. And then, of course, the truism of the rational paper, which is also map situated, to make us understand that we are dealing with maps. And a reason why we need to take this very seriously is because if we don't, and people eventually begin feeling the anxiety of not taking this problem seriously, they will go to fascism. They will end up in some fascism or some giant totalizing project of global capitalism, or a technological singularity based on an eschatology, or some sort of messiah project. And that is all going to together create a basket of trouble. I'll stop there.
Well, what I'm thinking about in regards to what you just outlined there globally is that, to me, it brings us now, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me like like the book as a whole really builds up towards and almost makes it the central point is the map situating. And in many ways, everything turns on this capacity to map situate. I would take it to be that in the age of givens, we have the unthought maps. Then what you were pointing towards, more what I would associate with the age of maps, is people think that they can get rid of maps. I took that to be the most difficult thing to write and think about in your work, which was the paradox, it seemed to me, of the age of maps coinciding with the getting rid of maps.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, and I think that even like brings home the point in a certain way, is that we thought we could get rid of maps, but then just maps totalize and proliferate.
Yeah. That's
So
it.
it's almost like, we have the proof that actually we have like almost the, I want to say like clinical or experimental proof that you cannot get rid of maps. Like, there's like the proof of our age is that you cannot get rid of maps.
Well, I'll jump in
But
very quickly and say that's very
sure.
astute, because one of the issues is I think we thought global pluralism would deal with maps. Like you say, if you unveil people to difference, they'll realize their map is not the territory and everything will be good. They'll overcome their difference. We thought the encounter with difference would convince people to overcome their differences, when in fact it created the absolute opposite effect, thus showing that the map is a deep nature, right? Like this, that is a deeper, that's exactly the paradox that is the most difficult to get, but it's the key. Global pluralism
Right.
did not address it. It unveiled it. It intensified it. That's exactly right.
So what I really wanted to do when I was thinking about your map situating, which is, it seems to me that what I was trying to work through there is your central axiom in many ways is that the true is not the rational. So how do we think, the way in which you think, I think the downside with that saying is that you can get the impression that you're against rationality in some way, which is not the case, obviously. But it can be sort of a first impression that someone might have. But I take to be the point is actually that we need to raise our rationality to be capable of the truth in a certain way,
Yeah.
and that this problem has not been precisely thought. So like if I take reason to be more on the side of coherence, to be truth on the more on the side of correspondence, and how do we become more real about being true, right? And then we have to get into the problem of what is the difference between the real and the true. But the system that I came up with, I'll propose it to you, is the rational but not true is more the ideological age of givens, the unthought maps. Then the true but not rational is more the madness in the age of maps, getting rid of maps. But then the rational truth would be the age of absolute knowing, which is kind of like this, in many ways, is that, that like the specter that I think hangs over our work.
Yes.
Is that too much to ask? Is that even possible? But it
Yep.
seems to, you know what I mean? But it seems to be the stakes of the work, which is the rational truth is are we able, not saying that reason and truth are the exact same, but that rational truth is, can we become subjects that are capable of rationally corresponding with the truth in a way that sustains itself in a drive, and a drive towards various situations. This would be a society, a community, a family, an individual of absolute knowing, all the way up and down and through. So you have the unthought maps, the getting rid of maps, to the reflexive maps, right? And this would be related to how do we become real about being true. So there's a system there. I'd love to know sort of how you make sense of that, and whether or not that corresponds to how you're seeing the situation and the stakes of the work.
100%. So that's all perfect. The idea that the true isn't the rational is to say that they're separate categories for the sake of rationality. Because most of the time, what we've done is basically said, if it is rational, it is true, it is right, it is correct. Maps want you to believe this. Maps really want you to believe that the true is the rational, because whatever is rational in a map necessarily maintains its consistency. So if you assume being rational and finding consistency equals being right, being true, then you will never question your map, and the map wins. It's totally vanished now. It is isness, right? But when you realize the map isn't the rational, the true isn't the rational, then you cannot assume the consistency of your map, therefore, is truth. It may be, but it may not be, right? And then, of course, there's an ever may be that then is the basis of thought. Like if there always is a maybe lurking over thought, then what would be thought that maybe, right? Well, this would be lack and start pointing toward absolute knowing, right? So first, there's an argument to be made that until the rational realize it's not the true, it's basically always going to waste itself on consistency. Like we're in a sense wasting rationality. We're not using it properly. All we're doing is maintaining map consistency or map ceiling or map totalization. We're wasting it on maps, you could say. So the distinction between the true, and the rational is for the sake of us actually using rationality properly, which of course will be a true rationality of absolute knowing, right? Well, likewise, to say the true isn't the rational is also to suggest that just because you do things that are true, if let's say you say, well, I have a emotional intuition that I just know is true. Okay, but that's not enough to say it's rational. You have to then do the conceptual mediation to determine if it is indeed rational, right? Just because you have a sense of the truth or you had a mystical vision, that is not enough to make it rational, because you can do it the other way, where you assume, I know it's true, therefore it is rational. No, it could be true. Just because you know it's true is not the work of making it rational, because also the work of making it rational means you conceptually mediate it, right? And we actually have a lot of unmediated mysticism, unmediated intuitions, unmediated emotionalism. That is a problem, right? So these are separate categories. These are separate activities. Well, that's setting up a necessary dialectic, because if they're separate and yet always relating, well, now we have a dialectic. We have a becoming other that's always already in operation, right? The other reason we're making this distinction between the true isn't the rational is because that realization would mean that when you are rational, there is always also something involved that is not rational, non-rational. That doesn't mean it is false, but non-rational. The reason why this is important is because whenever we talk about autonomous rationality, there actually is no such thing as autonomous rationality. You only imagine it that way. You only believe you're just being rational. Rationality, to be itself, must always sneak in an excess. It always must sneak in a principle that is an assumption, an axiom, that which cannot be brought into the consistency of it, right? Like the existence of God, or the non-existence of God, or the existence of, things as opposed to Owen Barfield's relations, or whatever. There's some principle that has to be in operation wherever there is rationality. And if you realize that, well, then you start, the chances of you being metaphysically proper, asking the categories of your thinking and asking where do those categories come from, skyrockets, because you realize you must be assuming categories from somewhere. And so the likelihood of reflexivity goes up, right? So autonomous rationality, in a sense, is always an imagining. It is something you're imagining, and that's why it tends to create pathologies and creates trouble, because it's not actual. It's something you imagine is actual. That once you get the true isn't the rational distinction, then you can become reflexive, and the likelihood of moving into metaphysics proper goes up, because you start asking about where do the categories of my thought come from, and all that goes from that, right? And you actually, like, where does the logic come from? And what is the logic that I am thinking through, right? The other reason why, so now the next critique could be, well, why not say the rational isn't the true? Why say the true isn't the rational? Why do it in that order, and why use the isn't logic? Because it does run the risk of making it sound like we're anti-rational. The reason for that is because the paper tries to show our natural experience is the concealing of the non-rational. Like we're constantly experiencing that we experience things primarily in rational terms. It's always being absorbed into our consistency. We're always concealing because the moment, like, to make a very simple example, the moment I say that's a bookcase, I have now translated the experience of the bookcase into words and given it to you in a manner that is meaningful to you, right? And now you can kind of have a sense of the logic and operation and the rational behavior. Oh, well, if that's a bookcase, you should put books on it. It brings with it a certain proper way to behave toward that thing, right? I experience things naturally in terms of that which is absorbed into rationality. I do not primarily experience things as non-rational. Because the moment I think about them, they're gone, right? They're absorbed into rationality. So the emphasis on the true isn't the rational is to try to get you behind your natural way of experiencing the world. Like it's trying to get you behind this quick concealing that is always going on to bring what you experience into the consistency of your worldview. It is trying to make you see this self-hiding that is always going on from this dialectic that is actually operation. The way we experience the world conceals us from dialectics. That's ultimately what is being said. Like we do not naturally experience dialectics because of the way we naturally bring everything into consistency, which consistency doesn't seem dialectical. It just seems consistent. There's no dialectic there until you realize the true isn't the rational, and then you realize that consistency is only possible because of a non-rational variable of which creates the place in which that consistency can be erected, the axioms that are not part of the Gödel numbers, as Gödel might say, that thus makes it possible, right? So we can say our very experience, and I'll pause here, the reason why the phrase is the true isn't the rational and it has an emphasis on the isn't the rational because it is trying to counter, we could say, our natural emphasis on experience everything in terms of consistency. Like it is a corrective to our natural experience. And in that way, it's trying to weigh it. It's trying to get it back into, I want to say a balance, but balance is a tricky word. It wants to get it back into a relation to increase the probability of dialectical thinking, ultimately. So it's the true isn't the rational to weigh against our natural experience of bringing everything into the consistent. I'll ask if that makes sense, and then I will give it back to you. But that's where I'm coming from in that phrase.
No, I mean, for me, I've never taken the axiom to suggest that you were against rationality, but I just wanted to sort of preface what I was saying with the idea that someone might stumble upon. I wanted to sort of almost clarify the way in which someone might equate that. But like, I think if you actually honestly work through the paper of again, talking about the map situating, that it's really about raising rationality to a new height in a way. And I like the way you were emphasizing, especially that we're wasting rationality. I like the emphasis on wasting rationality on maps. And really what your work is saying is we need to move from wasting rationality on maps. We're not even aware of our nature yet. And this is in many ways a hyperhuman thing. Like this idea that we're not human yet, that Carl Hayden Smith will talk about, in the sense that, no, it's about taking our nature, becoming more reflective about our nature, and actually raising rationality to a new height. Of course, it's a demanding height, right? Because the true and the truth and the rational are not the same thing. So it requires that's why we come to the drive eventually, where it's going to require this coherencing, right?
Yes.
You can never get a coherent final map. It's a coherencing. It's a constant attentive vigilance. What comes up in your work is faithful presence.
Yep.
What I've often emphasized is the patient concept. So there's this way in which there's a certain subjective disposition, a certain subjective attitude that's demanded by the true in order to bring that the rational can't just be given that it's the true. So
Yep.
that's super important. I've also sort of been situating this map consistency to map situating as something that is actually key for understanding. I think that's what Kant and Hegel are working at. I think that with the map consistency, I think the best axiom of map consistency is Kant's categorical imperative, right? To act in such a way as that you can will your action as a universal law to become absolutely consistent. But I think that what Hegel's trying to show, and this is where I think the absolute knowing comes into the equation, is that this absolute consistency is just moving an external consistency to an internal consistency.
Yes.
But it's actually not bringing your reason to the situation at hand.
Exactly.
Right. So that's really important. And I think that the way I want to frame this and the way I want to throw this back to you in context of the book, we've got the triad of the map natures, the map sealing, the map vanishing. We've got the importance of the map consistency, which brings us to me, the ultimate challenge of the map situating. But, and I want to emphasize this, that if people are reading this, they really have to go deeply into what is the stakes of the challenge of the map situating. And I think this is the crucial thing that I want to say in terms of my reading of the book, is that if we fail the challenge of the map situating, then we run into two specific problems. And then you outline that in the map totalizing and the map proliferating. So ultimately we do come around to a solution to that, which we will work towards. But I just want to say, if we don't reach the challenge of the map situating, immediately the challenge presents itself of the map totalization. And the way I was thinking about that through the book, and this has already come up in the conversation, so I'm quite glad that this is also sort of alluding to things you've already pointed toward, which is that I think in the transition from the age of givens to the age of maps, that the best way to study this is through 20th century political totalitarianism.
Oh, yeah.
And I think the first forms of political totalitarianism is you have the communism and the fascism, so you have the left and the right, that can both form a totalizing map totalization. But now I think that we're reaching an even deeper form of map totalization, which presents itself as individualism, but it's actually a new form of totalization. I actually think it's the map. I think the proof of your formula here, and this is sort of to me the proof of the logic of your thinking in a way, is that the map totalization naturally moves into the map proliferation in the
Yes.
form of capitalist individualism as totalization.
Yep.
So I just want to say that's how I've been reading it. That's how I've been thinking about it. And it'd say, if there's anything there in terms of the critical reading, in terms of how I'm thinking about these sections and sort of how you've framed it and the importance of the map situating and this breaking into the problem of the totalizing proliferating, then we'll go there.
I think it's very well put. I think it is very important to study the 20th century in terms of totalitarian movements. I think it's very important to also see the 20th century as emerging from failures of decentralization efforts, and ending the violence between different sects, or North versus South, the American Civil War, to re-centralize it, or religious warfares, right? We have been through ages. Givens created, so as maps create all this splintering into small fascist states, Givens did the same, because Givens and maps are structurally practically the same, even if they're technically distinct, right? So we know what proliferation or splintering creates. Religious warfare, it creates lots of issues, right? Now, of course, we have to think, Studebaker will emphasize federalism, we have to think about small governments, we have to think about how to maintain difference. But the key to something like a federalist project is you're somehow maintaining difference in universality at the same time. And history is a story where efforts like that eventually fail because of the ethical real that breaks in, that the difference is, well, we can't stand for that, because that's, we were okay with difference until you started doing slavery. We were okay with difference until you started doing, maybe eating animals or something, or child pornography. Like, we were okay with it until that, and now we can't allow it. And this is, the ethical real is the $1 million. That's $1 million problem.
Daniel, they're eating the dogs.
Yeah, they're eating the dogs. We have to do something.
They're eating the dogs, they're eating the cat.
Everything shuts down, fund the police force. So no, exactly. So I'll never forget that. But that ethical real is such a big deal. Because also the ethical real is the reality of the difference, that it's not just multiculturalism, it's pluralism. That's the key. Like, until the ethical real moment, you can tell ourselves we're different, but we're not deeply different. The ethical real is the revelation, the forced confrontation that we are deeply different, that if you are not ready for, blows up in your face. Now, that's an entirely different subject, but I'm just getting at, I agree with the emphasis on the 20th century. I always like to think the Guns of August, with gambling with Armageddon on the Cuban Missile Crisis, with work on the Civil Wars, the English Civil Wars, all of those as a historical package, I really think has to be taken seriously, and we haven't. What you were saying about map totalization and proliferation, this is exactly right. So, maps want to totalize. They want to basically be all there is. They want to achieve isness, which that will inevitably require authoritarianism. It will inevitably require removing difference. And this is where we talk about Benjamin Fontaine. I did a wonderful reading group with David Gosley and John David on Existential Monday. Fontaine is a fascinating thinker. He was Jewish, and he ultimately died in the concentration camps. And he constantly emphasized the need with Levi Sestan for the impossible. Humans without the impossible inevitably fall under totalitarianism, because the impossible is the excess beyond the rational system that you can always move beyond. If you don't have an excess, then rationality will eventually close on itself, and in itself it can define the rational from the irrational, and the irrational we can get rid of, or it's rational to get rid of the other, the Jew, because they're destroying the realization of the German people. The tricky move is that the reason why this can go together with proliferation is as maps splinter, every map to itself is a totalization, right? And so you have a totalizing logic that occurs in the splintering, or you just have one global map where everyone follows the same logic and you still get the dynamics of Fontaine going on, right? So what ends up happening is when the problems of map totalization appear, what people think the address is map proliferation. Well, let's make alternative maps to that. But every one of those proliferations will be isomorphic to the totalization because within themselves will create a totalization. When those problems merge, they say, well, let's go to a global unity because it was the proliferation that created this, and then you create another, and then you get a new totalization. So you just go back and forth forever, and then the proliferation it seems to escape the problems of totalization, but it actually recreates the conditions of totalization that leads you to the stuff that Benjamin Fontaine is talking about with an autonomous rationality, because in a totalization, you must remove otherness. Otherness destroys totalization. So every single map has to get rid of, somehow, by some logic or some direct force of violence or some mechanism of othering, every map will have to remove the other, or it will not be internally consistent. Well, it's gonna freaking get rid of the other somehow. It's gonna do it, and Benjamin Fontaine just shows that going on in Nazi Germany. And and I get into game theory there. I get into that often. I won't get into that here. But basically, you get a Nash equilibrium. You get a situation where in a totalization, if everyone is rational, you get a suboptimal result. So you need something non-rational. Ceston and Fontaine were like, that is the impossible. That is the excess. That is also lacking. That is the excess, that double move. Without which you're at everyone is going to be, everyone will be very rational. Like the crazy thing Fontaine said is he's like, well, Hitler is the supreme example of rationality, which you hear that and you go, oh my gosh, what is he saying? Well, he's saying that everything Hitler does logically follows from his presuppositions, and you can't show that his presuppositions are wrong, therefore there's no way to stop him. Right? Like argument alone or democracy, what are you going to do, right? But then, of course, this makes you say, well, that makes it sound like democracy is over. A lot of people are turning that way. Well, this is where we need true rationality and absolute knowing. This is where the future of democracy and the belief in the possibility of conversation and debate hinges upon an elevation of rationality, or you're going to get all sorts of trouble. So I'll give it back to you, but map totalization is going to talk about Benjamin Fontaine and game theory. Map proliferation is also going to obviously be talking a lot on conspiracies, because conspiracies are rational. They are internally consistent systems. And the argument is that the structure of a conspiracy is the same as an ideology. They work the same way within themselves. And when you understand this proliferation of ideologies and conspiracies are all ways that maps are maintaining themselves in light of the experience of global pluralism, in light of the revelation of difference. Well, let's just proliferate and isolate, right? And from that isolation, then create otherness, us versus them, the people with the knowledge or not. So the logic of proliferation is also going to be talking about Thomas Pynchon. I think Thomas Pynchon's novels are very important for understanding our moment, like The Crying of Lot 49, Gravity's Rainbow, etc., so forth. We will be talking about Coates's book on conspiracy and the subject, which I thought was useful for thinking these problems. I think we're going to be talking about conspiracies and Pandora's rationality, which is this idea of this unleashing of unbound rationality that solidifies in all these different maps. And then the kind of the Schrodinger's conceivability structures. There's no need to go into all of those things here, but the main idea is this relation between totalization and proliferation is very, very real. And you see, the problem is within every one of those proliferated maps, the experience will be, we need to totalize this. We need everyone, so every one of them contains the kernels of totalitarianism in their own consistency. If you think that different maps are going to stay within their proper bounds, you are mistaken, because their proper bounds is an incorporation of everyone. And when you encounter everyone else's own different takes on what their proper bounds is, then conflict begins to emerge, disagreement, destabilization, and all of these different things. So ultimately, the problem of this is exactly what you're saying, is that all of this leads to map totalization and map proliferation, and that's where we're in. And we're stuck just going back and forth. If we don't take seriously map situating, and then, of course, the map drive, of which leads to this creation, and actually think the drive, not just the maps that come out of it, the coherence, and to take it more on its own terms, which, again, that's a lot, but I'll stop there, then we're just going to keep doing this. It's just going to keep happening over and over and over again, and the political projects will repeat. It will be a problematic repetition as opposed to a Hegelian, repeat that can lead to a negation sublation. I'll pause.
So I want to say that the way I've been thinking through your book is that this actually tracks with an interesting reading of history. Like, we can actually formulate an interesting reading of history. And again, the two main categories here that I feel like you're working through, the age of givens and the age of maps, with the possibility, however seemingly impossible, of an age of absolute knowing as kind of what this is potentially pointing towards. I want to say that the way I'm reading it with the age of givens is that it was over in a way that we cannot go back to it, probably related to the seeds of globalization. I think that through the history of philosophy, it's clear that we, as it were, got a certain vantage point on what you were talking about with the map natures, the map sealing, the map vanishing. And then therefore we saw the problem of consistency, and we strove to think the problem of consistency. Again, I think the categorical imperative is a good example of that. And then I want to say we saw the problem of the situation, but we completely failed to handle the problem of situation. And I want to sort of suggest that the location where we saw the problem of situation, but we ultimately failed the problem of situation, is not in the critique of pure reason, Kant's project, but rather in the critique of pure desire. That the problem of situation requires a handling of desire to drive.
Yes.
That if we can't handle the problem of desire to drive, we can't handle the situation. And so then it necessarily opens up into what we've seen in the 20th and the early 21st century as this oscillation between the totalization and the proliferation, where you're saying we're stuck. So I want to say the map totalization, we've got the communism, fascism. We can now see in a certain way, I think, where we are in the culture is that, okay, what we're dealing with communism and fascism in the 21st century are really shadows of totalization in the 20th century. And what we saw actually with totalization is actually, to me, proliferation shows the impotence of it.
Yes.
To me, if totalization proliferates, then actually it's impotent.
Exactly.
Because real totalization wouldn't proliferate. So the proliferation is a deeply impotent motion. I am increasingly saying that in the map proliferation, this probably links in your work most closely to the situation of capital. So we have to think the situation of capital and the map proliferation in the failure of the map situating in regards to a critique of desire. And then this critique of desire naturally would lead us in your work to the map drive. But I just want to say the problem of the map proliferation, as I'm reading it, is that the rhizomatic structure, the decentralization, is actually a mirror obverse of a new form of totalitarianism, which I think is more, in many ways, insidious than previous forms, because I think it's what we're calling techno-feudalism as our new given. It's kind of like, and the idea is that actually the centralization is the techno-feudalism as the new given. That's what we can't not use. And when we romanticize a rhizomatic structure, when we romanticize just a distributed structure, we don't see actually that it's only capable of operating because of this invisible totalitarianism, right? So these things become mirrors of each other in an interesting way. But, that gives us a window into actually, I don't want to end us on a hopeless note, because it does give us a window into talking about the critique of pure desire and the map drive and how that might bring us to think the situation. But first, I think we should think a little bit about this oscillation of totalization, proliferation, and yeah, is there anything you'd want to expand on in regards to how, at least from my mind, the map proliferation needs to be situated in regards to the situation of capital?
Everything you said is exactly right. Proliferation unveils a certain impetus. There's an impetus in it that is trying to replicate within itself a totalization, that yet the very proliferation occurred because the totalization didn't work. So there's a kind of impetus there, like, okay, this failed, but all we can do is repeat the thing that failed on a smaller scale, within a more condensed scale. So there's an impetus in it that is in operation that then the very consistency of the map tries to hide people from. Like, there's a concealment of the impetus, that the very concealment of the impetus is evidence of the impotence. That's all those kind of different layers, right? Because you don't want, it won't work if people see it as an impetus activity. So you have to conceal, but the very act of having to hide is itself impetus. Because if it was truly confident, you wouldn't need to hide it. It could be in the open. If it truly is no stronger than people's realization, then it's very weak, right? So it's impetus all the way down. It's weak all the way down. That's exactly right. Which is both the hope and the terror. Because the terror is that this thing that we're doing to hold ourselves together as subjects, which is absolutely the problem of desire. It's 1,000,000% the problem of desire. This thing that we've created to deal with the problem of desire is incredibly weak, which means, oh my gosh, it could break at any moment and we're all screwed. But that also means, wow, it's incredibly weak, so an alternative is not impossible. Yay! So the hope and the terror are two sides of the same coin. The weakness is the hope and the terror at the same time. And that's this move of the faithful presence of being like actively working for the alternative, but not being in a hurry, knowing this is a very serious thing, but also not being hopeless and also seeing possibility. There's a certain proper emotional disposition that is hard to describe when you're dealing with this thing that is weak. And because it is weak, there's hope and terror at the same time. So that should be noted. What you described of the movement of the age of givens to the age of maps to the necessary age of absolute knowing, yes, that perfectly maps. That's exactly how I think about it. And the question is the age of absolute knowing possible, or at least possible on a critical map, on a critical maps, to have real political, economic, and social change? Because it is, there's two questions. Does it need to be 100% of people or a critical mass of people? Because a critical mass is that of which has social, political ramifications, ultimately.
I would just say quickly, because of children and because of, I think mostly because of children and because of reproducing the species, I think it has to be a critical mass. It can't be everyone. Because necessarily that's something that, it's more, are the people close to the levers of social and political power on all levels, and by all levels I mean family, community, and state. If people on all levels, that would be the it's more like the situation of absolute knowing. Our absolute knowing situated properly?
Yes, I completely agree, and that would actually align with Mr. Hunter's book on To Change the World, which I do take as a very important case study of all of this. There are people who have done research on the question of what changes the world. How does the world change? Which I think if people believe there is a critical moment that requires some sort of changing of the world, these sort of thinkers are quite important, and we've discussed them many times before. But basically in Mr. Hunter's work, it is a critical mass of people of whom have exposure to power influence. But this is also Hegel. You have to be in the power of an influence, which runs the risk of you being captured by the power of influence, and you have to, in that risk of capture, shine with the alternative. It's a tall order, but it does work. And this is where this is where seclusion won't change the world. This is where forming, and I say this carefully, but this is where forming alternative communities have a place if they are a training zone, but if they are other, like if it's an alternative community away from things, it could be fire ants on, as Vanderclave was saying with the fire ants. It can be a fire ant thing gathering together to survive, but it can't change the system, right? Now, if you believe it's impossible to change the system, then maybe a isolated community is the best you can do. And the issue is that in the past, people getting on a ship and going to a different country for religious freedom could work, but we are no longer in that age. And this would be, I'd have to go into this, that only worked though in the age of givens. because you leaving did not make you question the givens. You still had the conviction, and that gave you the existential stability to handle a new territory, building a new government. The givens allowed you to build from the ground up successfully. If you don't have givens, going off and starting something from people who have already lost givens is going to lead into internal conflict, disagreement on what the community could do, and things fragment apart. So that, like, there's a mistake here on seeing how in the past people were able to leave to new lands, start new civilizations, and that leading to great change, where you say, well, we should do that again, maybe by going to Mars or something, or just going somewhere. The issue is that was in the age of givens. That changes things a lot. You've got to, that's not going to work, in my opinion. To change the world now, you have to do it in the midst of the system while shining with the alternative in a place that could habituate you out of the alternative that you want to shine with. So it's, and you have to wrestle with that negativity actively in the presence of the thing that wants to change you to the logic of capital, per se. So it's a very tall order, but it is not impossible. It's just very hard. But if we do not do this, then the problem of desire will not be taken care of, because I think the problem of the situation and the problem of desire go together. The other thing I was going to say is that in the same way that rationality has been wasted, I am of the opinion that drive has been wasted. We have wasted it on making maps. We have wasted it on logics of capital. We have wasted drive, actually. That the age of absolute knowing, if possible, would be an age where we don't waste rationality and we don't waste drive. We have not actually used it well. And so, because mostly what people's drive is now doing, in my opinion, is it's either getting captured by a logic of capital in various forms, which can be described, etc., so forth, or people who are retired. You see this with a lot of people who are retired, or how they're using their free time. They're using their drive to map create, or to map facilitate, to research, to figure out why their worldview is correct. They're spending a whole lot of time intrinsically motivated to actually map seal, or to find map consistency, to find a worldview. How many retired people spend a lot of time they start going to church, they do Bible readings, they do Bible schools, and that's not all inherently bad, but most communities that are forming are communities of map drive, where drive is captured by map making for the sake of creating and facilitating maps. And in that sense, drive is being wasted. Now, I don't want to say that people, forming communities to find people who share their map and they find belonging, that is necessarily bad. But if that is not negated into absolute knowing, you've got problems. You've got fascism. You've got isolated groups that are returning to something pre-modern, right? So if we don't recognize that map making, maps tend to capture drive for the benefit of the map, we're going to waste our drive. We're not going to deal with drive. And then the problem of desire is not addressed, because I think the way you address the problem of desire is the movement from desire to drive, on the other side of negativity and absolute knowing, right? Well, if all drive is doing is being captured by map making, then it is not going to be a product of the sublation of the problem of desire. It's actually just going to be creating the map in which the problem of desire is unaddressed. That's the weird move. Where if we keep we're wasting drive in that it's only being used either to maintain desire, not to sublate desire, to create the consistency in which desire searches for its objects or what it wants, as opposed to actually changing our relationship to drive to where it is not just serving desire and objects of desire or things within a consistency, but actually to open new conditions of possibility in absolute knowing. Now, that has to be expanded on, but this is just very important, that I just think we've wasted drive. In the same way we've been wasting rationality, we've been wasting drive. And the other thing I was going to say before I forget, on this proliferation, totalitarianism, recreating the same things, the insidious totalitarianism you were describing, of techno-feudalism, etc., so forth. This is very, very important. What I will start that a way I would
kind of functions as givens in a way. Like it seems to me like like the platforms function as givens.
Yes, they do. This is the weird thing where the loss of givens creates this givenness of the logic of capital and platforms, right? Where they're not technically, this is the weird move I try to make in the Belonging Again series. They're not quite the same as givens in that, in Zizek, this is where Zizek with the fetish is important. We know that capitalism is a social construct. We know it's created, and yet nevertheless it still works. That's the slight difference, where givens only work if you're thoughtless. Capital, you can critique it and still be a capitalist. That's where, just like it's almost in a sense more difficult than givens, in the same way they're more like, for me, capital functions more like the map than it does a given, even though maps are practically identical to givens, all these weird little slight distinctions, because you can know your map is incomplete, and that actually helps it. Likewise, you can know capital is problematic, and that actually helps it, because then you think you're a critic of it as you participate in it, right? And so there is absolutely something about capital that is practically the same as givens, in the same way that maps are practically the same as givens, even though they're not technically the same. And, a big thrust in my thinking is always that play between the practical and the technical, because I think ideology benefits from that distinction a lot. And we tend to define the technical as more real than the practical, but the truth of the subject is the practical is more real than the technical. The technical is actually in service of ideology preservation, because we can say, well, I know that capitalism is not true. Technically, I know that it's a social construct, and that actually helps us keep the practice going, the notion of the technical truth. So the idea of techno-feudalism having a certain givenness to it is exactly the case. The way I like to say the operation of the totalization that's going on in capital techno-feudalism, which is, I know Varoufakis says that capitalism is over and it's techno-feudalist, it's all fine. It's the totalization of what I call in Belonging into, well, and we've talked about it before, it's the meta-judgment, as in how you value things. The way you see things is totalized. Like what Marx will describe, that we talk about, is the abstract social value, is the way, as I say, that bookcase is worth $100, that, this camera is worth $20 or whatever. My way of understanding reality is in terms of the commodity form, or in terms of, is it practical, is it valuable, right? So the notion of value in the problematic way of the value form that hinders value formulation, as I was actually talking with Dimitri about, and I really enjoyed speaking with Dimitri, and I highly suggest his recent Substack of absolute communization. It's very important work. But we are now totalized in the same way. We're totalized in this way that we interpret reality, that we understand it in terms of fungibility, and is it practical, is it not? But since this is in the background of the proliferation, it seems like there is no totalization. But every single one of those proliferations are individuals who seem to be separate of the whole, recreate in their condition the logic of capital in understanding reality in terms of capital, right? Of price and commodity and practical and utility, right? And so the proliferation actually hides the totalization, because it seems like there's a difference. It seems like people are different and doing their own platforms and following their passions and following what they're interested in. But actually, all of these things have in the background the same logical form. Therefore, they're actually a total. There's a totalization that is going on. So there is absolutely but this is where it gets fun, because this is why the age of absolute knowing is a tall order, but necessary, is because you need a new logical form, which we can associate with AB versus AA. So let's put it this way. In map proliferation, there is still in every map AA. So they're different, but they're actually totalized in their AA-ness, their lack of dialectical thinking, right? So there's difference, but not difference at the same time. In order to get absolute knowing, you have to introduce the AB into the proliferation, which in a way intensifies difference, but that intensification of difference is in terms of an AB that thus creates a universal in the singularity, because every proliferation entails that AB. Therefore, there is a universal relation between the proliferation that also is the mechanism of open to the other. But to get there, you have to get people out of the habits of the commodity form, habits of the logic of capital, that they're always already thinking before they even realize it. They're already thinking in terms of, will this make money? Is this practical? Is this not? Before they even realize it, and that's socially reinforced by their parents and community and et cetera, so forth, right? That's the totalization that I think is an operation now that could be argued is uniquely insidious, because people think they're free. Oh, well, you can get whatever job you want in the system. You can do what you want. So therefore, it is not a totalization, but actually The logical form is the totalizing. And that is very, very difficult to work with, because it doesn't seem present. It seems, what does the logical form seem like? Isness. Okay, you guys can critique practicality and utilitarianism all you want, but it just is the case. It just is how things is. It's a map that has isness then. It's succeeded. It's truly sealed itself. It's truly vanished. It's succeeded in that. So I do think capital, and I'll give it to you, I do think capital is a map. It is like Gibbons, and it could be argued that it is profoundly succeeded at map vanishing, map sealing, map vanishing, and that it has been able to do it so well because it's so perfectly aligned with our map nature. That's the issue. Like, we are naturally already operating in a manner that is uniquely like capital, which you could say, I guess, is Kantian in that way. And some people have pointed out that capital and Kantianist thought go together. And we do seem to naturally experience reality in a Kantian way. We don't get to the thing in ourselves. That seems to be true in our experience. But that's why the true isn't the rational distinction is important, because the true is always already in the rational. The limit is already in the phenomenon, right? It's just that it has to be thought. But I'll pause there and give it back to you.
Well, it would make sense in the sense that Kant's project was deeply about the way reality appears to us.
Yes.
Right? Like, how does reality appear to us? And sort of getting to sort of a phenomenal description, I suppose, of that appearance as the work of philosophy. What I really want to take seriously in this is, Mikey Downs works on the AI capital unity, which is inspired by Nick Land. Is a great challenge there. And I think, the deeper challenge there in the context of what I read in your book with map proliferation is that if our maps are impotent in their appearing powerful, but really behind the scenes there is, both Mikey and Nick Land will say that AI capital is already a superintelligence, right? So there's like this idea that there's already a superintelligence. It's more important. It's more powerful than us. It's smarter than us, and it's in many ways already won. I think is the logic of Nick Land and perhaps also Mikey. Now, in this situation, and when you really think with this seriously, it doesn't seem like there's any way to think outside of this predicament. You do come to a point of view of, well, it's all impossible. We might as well just build our small scale little isolated communities. That's all we can do, right? There's a way in which you can come to that point of view and think, well, that's where we actually are. Where I've tried to work with that is related to what you were saying with, there is actually nowhere else to go. It's not like we can go across the ocean from Europe to America and start the United States and start from the ground up and try and really do a novel new experiment. There's nowhere else to go. And I think that with Land's philosophy, what I've focused on is the way in which exit and escape function in his philosophy, right? The way in which, and I feel like this is the logic of the British Empire, even, you could say. It's like this logic of there's another place to go, there's another land, there's another place, maybe China, right? Right. But I would say I want to make, I want to recognize how difficult it is to make this distinction and how difficult it is to build out a project that doesn't become cynical in the face of this seemingly impossible reality. But if we were to say that the age of absolute knowing is what we're aiming for, and if we're to say that the age of absolute knowing is about situating, it's about not everyone becoming absolute knowers, but situating absolute knowing related to power and influence, right? If we can situate absolute knowing in regards to power and influence, then that would be an alternative path to the escaping and starting again fantasy, whether it's going off into Mars or escaping to another planet, the idea that we can start again. And what is being situated is the rational drive and its waste. That there's a huge intelligence, there's a huge super intelligence, there's a huge resource, right? We always talk about resources externally. We always talk about waste externally. We don't often talk about waste in terms of the rational drive. right? And actually, Zizek emphasizes in the end of Absolute Knowing that he thinks the rational drive is immortal,
Right.
right? And that's something that I've been sort of pulling up more and more. It's more like reframing. It's not that I disagree with the concept of death drive. It's that I think the concept of death drive needs to be reframed as a mortal drive. And I think that actually can be, I can rationally justify why, reframing it as, I think it's actually almost like, on certain level, it's like a PR, it's for public relations, right? On some level,
Yeah, yeah,
but
yeah,
there is
yeah.
actually like a meaningful distinction between Freud and Zizek on death drive, which does, I think, justify the name change.
Hmm.
But I just want to say that what the rational drive, or what the mortal drive here is being oriented towards in your work, is, I think, the real situation as the condition of being true,
Yeah.
right? And that's currently the wasted resource. We live in a,
Yes.
people say we live in a post-truth world,
Right.
right? That's kind of the situation we're in, and that's why we go back to philosophy. That's why we do the philosophy. So I just want to
Yes.
say, final thing before throwing it back to you is, Dimitri pointed his article, Communization and Absolute Capitalism.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I take that to be the situation of capital in your work, right? The situation of capital. You've already alluded to the power of capital, how successful capital's been. That's, I think, what Dimitri's talking to with absolute capitalism. That as soon as you think you're outside of it, you've tricked yourself. As soon as you think you're the critic that, as it were, can morally stand above it, you've tricked yourself, right? I went through that in terms of forcing myself in many ways to learn small business and engage in capital and actually learn from trial and error in capital. Sort of just accepting that I have to work with the situation of capital. In this, what has always appeared to me in my mind is, and this is, I want to say that the way I think about this is totally divorced from traditional presuppositions of what the word usually means. But I've had the question of, well, what is socialism in this context? Now, what is socialism in this context? Now, in if I'm relating to your work, I would link it to the weaving with others, right? Like that's social, like weaving with others. How do I weave with others? In Dimitri's work, he's talking about it as communization, right? He's talking about more of a process of communization rather than as a teleological endpoint that we're all striving towards as an absolute state. Now, I think that what your work, and this is, I'll throw up, what your work ultimately points towards this map drive, which is related to the intrinsic motivation that appears in most of your work. Obviously, the drive is central in my work. So
Right.
now you say that drive and intrinsic motivation aren't intrinsically good,
Right.
but it's also pointed towards that the map and the intrinsic motivation are key for the map situating, which would be the good and maybe the beautiful as well.
Yep.
Right? If we fail to map, now we've already covered in this podcast, if we fail the map situating, we fall into the map totalizing and the map proliferating. I want to say that.
Yep.
I think the key that I'm taking from your work back to the original triad is we want our rationality to be dialectical. We want to recognize that the limits of our rationality is not the impotence of our rationality, it's actually the power of our rationality. That's what we've been wasting.
Yes.
That the limits of our rationality is actually the key to be able to weave with others, or what Dimitri might call communization. And that has to be situated in not a foreclosure or a repression or a disavowal of the situation of capital, not as something that we need to overcome with our maps, but something, the negativities of which we cannot fail to think slip away. For if we do, then we fall asleep into its logic. So that's kind of how I'm making sense of your work, its offer, how it interfaces with my work, how it might interface with some other key concepts. But I'll definitely, just get your reflections on all of that, and anything else you want to bring up, we totally
Sure.
can stay and discuss it at length.
Well, you're a gentleman, and I agree with everything you just said. As a kind of overarching point, one of the great challenges is let's just take four that I talk about often. We'll say drive, intrinsic motivation, drive. I'm using very interchangeably, but I'll say drive, true, rationality, and beauty. All four of those is necessary for the address, but not sufficient. This is the problem. All of these things that we need for the address, the address of global pluralism, that's not a regression. The term address and belonging again is important. All of these are necessary but not sufficient. And because they are necessary, if they are misordered, they are extremely destructive. That's the problem. Like the things that we need for our situation are all things that if misordered, almost alluding to Augustine, or misused or not properly dialecticized, actually become worse than not doing them at all. Let's take beauty, because that's a big one. Beauty is constantly used to justify racism, fascism, aesthetics, and different things like that, right? But beauty, if thought with all, has this characteristic of collapsing your categories and forcing the subject to go through a certain, it can force the subject through a certain purgatory that is actually an encounter with lack. That can be very good. But if beauty is misordered, it becomes evil. It becomes an incredibly destructive force. Let's take drive. Drive is a necessary component of this, or with that, the mercy of desire, but drive could also be used to have you working forever under techno-feudalism, because you actually have a drive to express yourself, and that's exactly then a perfect commoditization engine, right? The rationality is incredibly important, but separated from the truth, it leads to autonomous rationality that gives you, as Adorno and Horkheimer talks about, it can give you the world wars. Truth is incredibly important, but without conceptual mediation, you get conspiracies, and you get radical mystical visions that are not mediated and lead to crises, right? So one of the problems is we are in an age where there are things that are necessary that, if not properly handled, are not sufficient, and if they are mishandled, the consequences are dire. That's another reason why the age of absolute knowing is such a tall order, because the things for its possibility require great, great risk. But if that risk is not taken on, then a regression is also seemingly necessary. And furthermore, our self-effacement before the capital AI that Mikey Downs writes so well on is inevitable, seems very problematic. So the stakes are very high in our moment. Socialization, communization, the weaving together, yes, I think that's beautifully put. And there's something about the weaving together that is part of this address that is very, very important. AI is a very interesting thing to consider, because AI is ultimately, so there's a few things. If a complete map is actually precisely what unveils the Gddel point, it precisely unveils its necessity on that outside of rationality. It is extremely possible that the completed capital AI, Nick Land's AI, will actually unveil the incompleteness of rationality, that it actually will open up a Gddel point, that in witnessing can either destroy us or actually open up the role of the hyperhuman versus the transhuman, to use the great Hayden Smith's work, or conviviality versus manipulation, alluding to Ivan Illich, right? It could be precisely it could be precisely AI that most finishes us off, per se, that in its success completes a consistency that unveils its point of incompleteness, that is the space of the human, is the space of actually where we fit into the picture for technology to extend us versus to replace us. This would be expected if AI is an operation of consistency more than correspondence. If it is more of an operation, the question is, does AI map make, or does it truly reason? Like, what is AI primarily doing, right? I think there is very good reason to think that it is a map-making mechanism, and it is extremely good at that map-making. But does it necessarily create correspondence? Well, by definition, it could not. But that doesn't mean it's wrong. It could be so rational that it is practically correspondent, even though it is not technically correspondent. But this is where, for me, everything opens up. The very necessary distinction between practical and technical sets a limit on the possibility of AI, even in its success. And it is that limit that could be the thing that the AI cannot think, that the human can think, that creates a certain opening. So let's put it other ways first. All right, what is one of the reasons why AI is supposedly so amazing? It never sleeps. It never gets tired. It can work all day, and it's perfectly rational and it doesn't make mistakes. So in a way, AI is supposedly not wasting drive and rationality. This whole idea we've said that humans is, one of the overarching themes has been that humans are wasting rationality and drive. We've been wasting them because we've allowed it to be captured and we haven't thought what we need to think. Well, the whole idea is that AI won't waste drive and rationality. It's going to be able to do it perfectly. Well, what if actually it's the case that the only way to not waste rationality and drive is precisely in getting tired, in running out of energy, and not being able to think everything? What if actually the inabilities of the human are actually the necessary preconditions for the opening up of rationality drive in the proper way? And that actually the inability of AI to waste rationality or to waste drive is precisely a problem. Our very possibility of wasting these things, of confusing the technical and the practical, may be itself an error that opens up possibilities that AI is not afforded. It may open up a distinction of truths, per se, non-rational variables that can be considered, that then rationality can find a consistency on, but AI itself actually could not realize those non-rational variables because it is precisely that of which does not get tired, or that does not feel like it can't think something, that does not actually experience the lack of consistency. Now, one can say, well, what the frick would be opened up by getting tired? What would be opened up by being unable to think everything? What in the world would be opened up by not being a global intelligence, but just a local intelligence? What could be opened up by that? Well, if you assume that nothing can be opened up by that, that's a presupposition. That's something you don't know. You'd have to, know the truth of the absolute to know that. So it's not a crazy proposition. And here's the other key. What if the interaction of people that are so limited is able to create a collective emergent intelligence that is not possible under any other circumstances? Like the very limitations of the human, when collectively brought together, are able to think thoughts or to consider things that actually can't be considered by an intelligence that doesn't get tired or that doesn't feel limitation or that doesn't actually experience difference. Because the other issue would be that AI, by definition, does not experience difference. It can't. It is a consistency. There is no difference. It can consider different things, but it cannot consider deep difference. The whole idea of AI is a lack of the experience of deep difference. Anything it experiences, it will immediately bring into its own consistency, right? What if the experience of deep difference opens up things and opens up conditions of possibility that otherwise would not be opened up? Now, all of this would have to be expanded on, but if we automatically assume that this is not possible, that's a presupposition, and we would have to be correspondent and know the truth, not just a map, to make that claim, which we cannot do. Oh, and that itself is a limit. That would be that of which could be brought into the equation to be thought together, right? And so for me, if I were to be a betting man, the success of capital AI will actually unveil a Gddel point in the dream of autonomous rationality that will set a certain limit on AI in its very unlimitedness, that will actually increase the value of the limits of the human being, because those afford the possibility of thoughts and experiences that are only afforded by those limits, that the possibilities of those limits are then intensified and brought into greater qualities when they're able to socialize with people who are different, who have different experiences of those limits, and those people can actually weave together. There is no reason for me to assume that that is not possible, because that would be a presupposition to assume that's not possible. AI basically is going to be the AI will be the will practically be the truth that the true is the rational. It will practically be that of which for itself will be the true is the rational, and it will perfectly be able to bring into its consistency everything to make it practically the case the true isn't the rational. But that means it will not actually be able to, in of itself, truly think the reality that the true isn't the rational, technically. That will be uniquely afforded still to the human being, which then means that the possibility of being true is in a unique quality afforded to the human being if they can deal with the negativity of it. What I can imagine, I guess another thing that I would say I can imagine from that is that human beings would be very good at well, you could say, to use a loaded term in philosophy, form makers versus just information producers. So if AI is rationality, anything we throw at it, it's going to be able to find the perfect consistency of it. Well, every form you throw at it, it will fulfill, but it won't generate a new form. Human beings will be able to generate new forms, and Alex Ebert has alluded to this as well. So, for example, once human beings invent the piano, AI will be in a split second able to create every possible piano song that you can think. But will it be able to create the violin, like a new instrument, a new form per se? Will it be able to create sand art or new forms, new art forms? Whatever art form we create, AI will instantly be able to calculate every possible variation of that art form, but can it generate a new form of art? That is where I think we will probably see human intelligence get more in the business of new business forms, new art forms. And the beauty of a partnership with AI is that whatever form we come up with or think is a good form, you can then give to the AI to see if it can generate anything within that form. If not, you say, well, that was a bad idea. If so, you go, great, look at the infinite possibility that then is created. Oh, and by the way, even if AI can create every possible piano song that would ever be made, it cannot experience those piano songs for you. And you will then have the unique experience, almost alluding to Greg Dimber's work, of those songs. Oh, and then also, there would still be the sorting mechanism problem. And what I mean by that is a human being is probably better at guessing what piano song you need to hear right now than the AI. There's a sorting problem. Could AI be able to determine by your emotional state what of all the millions of piano songs it could create is the one that you need? The only one it would create is if you tell it. But if humans are always lying to themselves, self-deceived, or don't know what they desire, then whatever input you give to the AI would easily just be a mechanism of self-deception. Human beings are pretty good, or can be better at, telling what somebody needs who themselves doesn't know what they need. And we can be a better sorting mechanism, right? So even if AI can generate every possible piano song, I might be better of generating the piano song that is most fitting for the situation that we are in, right? So situational thinking, which ties with form and classical thought, fittingness, and et cetera, so forth, this gets a premium because there's the sorting problem of what every situation calls for, that the human, who's a dialectical thinker and good at situational reasoning, is probably, well, there's no reason to think, will not be in a better position to gauge the mean, what is fitting for, than AI that would simply be able to calculate all possibilities in the consistency of the situation. To calculate all possible consistencies in the situation is not the same as determining the fitting consistency relative to the subjects that are involved in the situation. That meta judgment, as I call it, is still where the human being getting really good at that meta judgment, that judgment of fittingness and what is afforded by the situation. There is plenty of room for the human to still be involved in that, of which the AI, in my opinion, is less positioned to actually do well, precisely because it is not limited. Because it is not limited, the premium of determining what is fitting out of all the possibilities is less necessary than just presenting all the possibilities. Well, let me just throw them all to make sure I get the best one, right? The human, precisely because I can only think one, I have a premium and incentive to be really good at telling the best one that of all of the possibilities because of my limitation. So there is way more incentive for the human to get good at determining the best than the AI, because of the very limitation that human beings have, right? And I am just of the opinion that AI is actually, in its success, going to unveil this problem. I can't prove it. I may be entirely wrong. I strongly think that will be the girdle point of AI, is its AI will be able to give you all possible consistencies for a situation, and it will see no reason not to because it is unlimited. Whereas the human being, because they are limited, will be in the direction of determining what is most fitting for this situation. But that skill is inhibited on the human by the logic of capital they are trained into. This is the problem. We are trained and habituated into a logic of fungibility, which of course is the opposite of fittingness. Fungibility means, well, whatever works, whatever practicals. Fittingness is like, no, there is one particular song that this person needs to hear in this particular moment, and it is not the case that any other song will do. There is a radical particularity here that needs to be thought, right? Well, that meta judgment is unfortunately threatened in something humans are trained out of by the logic of capital, right? And that's why working against that logic to think well, and in terms of more particularity, becomes extremely important. But those, I'll give it back to you for any thoughts on any of that, or et cetera, or anything, is that my impression, what this book did for me, we can say this thinking of the problem of internally consistent systems has led me to believe that AI will simply prove the very best possible intelligence at creating internally consistent systems, of which its very lack of limit and its inability to make the mistake of wasting rationality and drive sets it up to only basically flood us with consistency, but it will not be able to determine what is fitting, which is afforded to the human by limitation, which is something we will be better at to the degree we dwell in the Gddel point instead of wasting our minds on creating maps and wasting rationality on consistency. AI is about to show us that's a waste. That's kind of the trick. It's about to show us that's a waste, actually, which will then reflect on us as like, maybe rationality should be something else. Maybe we should use thinking in a different way. And that's why I actually see a kind of hope in the Nick Land scenario, because I think it will actually show all of this in operation and actually make us see limits as our power, which of course is a Hegelian move. But I throw it back at you.
Well, I think, Daniel, that you need to add another supplement to your book. I think that's where I think I've put a burden onto your shoulders. That you need a third supplement that specifically unpacks this AI dimension, which is it's quite good. It's quite good. I just want to say that in that context, in the situation of your hypothesis about AI, that either will continue to oscillate in this stupid map totalization, map proliferation issue, and that would be the situation where I think Nick Land has the final word, or Nick Land waits, as you say sometimes. Or we can finally take up this problem of the situation and the critique of desire towards drive. Now, the problem with that, and that brings us back full circle, we could say brings us back into a circle of circles. The problem is that we enjoy our ideology and we abhor the real. Right? So you've made, you know what I mean? We've made the case that the AI might be able to do the perfect rational drive. Now, it can do that on the condition that it's autonomously rational, which means it doesn't have to deal with the real.
Correct.
So in many ways, the great thing that you're saying that AI's realization will bring us towards is, I think, at the end of the day, the stakes of we abhor the real. Are we willing to bring our rational drive towards the real as the condition of being true?
Yep.
Otherwise, we'll keep wasting it. Otherwise, we'll never bring our rational drive to the real of situations that we have to deal with, we don't want to deal with. Now, AI capital will also bring us, hopefully AI capital, if this is true, will solve a lot of problems that at the moment people don't want to do. That's also possible. The question is, what types of new problems will it bring us to, or rather, what types of real situations will it present us with? And are we going to become the types of subjects that can live up to those situations or not? I like the idea of humans as form makers, and that the only way to be form makers is with a rationality that's cultivated for the truth in real situations. And I think that what I've seen, for example, with AI music or whatever, is that it can do all sorts of recombinations of existing music, but because it doesn't have its source in the real, like, and the best musicians are always sourcing from the real.
Yes.
And the best and the best musicians are, let's say, if the music is rational, it's a rationality that's expressing a truth that the AI would never have access to.
Exactly.
So in that sense, there is a new world that opens up. It's just that we're going through the death of a world. And I've, for a long time thought that the metasystem that our parents and our grandparents lived within was dying away and something new was being born. and that our very lives were going to be the material of that death and rebirth. And I think the biggest monster that lurks in this death and rebirth is the idea that the AI capital will wipe us out. That will be the death and no rebirth. But I think where we situate our work and where we situate our drive is in the possibility that even though it's a narrow window, it's threading the eye of a needle, that there is another way. There is another way to live. There is another way to think. There is another way to move forward. And that way requires a great burden. It involves a great struggle with philosophy, with the great texts. It involves thinking about thinking, which this work is a great testament to. The challenge of thinking. You make the case that if we don't think thinking, then we very well might be stuck.
Yep.
Might be stuck in this map totalization, map proliferation issue, which I think we've done a good job in this podcast of demonstrating is very much alive, very much something that's going on today in regards to concrete phenomena. But that another path, a mispath, is still open to us. And well, I'll just say, in terms of this work situated within the context of the O.G. Rose's book, O.G. Rose's books as a whole, I take, you say as much in the book, that the belonging again works is really about an address to the impossibility of going back to the givens, right? It's about how do we belong given that the givens are gone, that we cannot go back, right? This other series, which is probably a bit lesser known than the Belonging Again series, I take it to be the opposite of the Belonging Again series, because it's not about loss, it's about the problem of maps. It's about given the loss of givens, now we have to approach straight on the problem of maps, right? Now, I think both series, as mirrors of each other, one dealing with the loss of givens, the other dealing with the problem of maps, they point towards this age of absolute knowing, which might sound strange, might sound. Now, we've worked towards in this talk the importance of, and that's clarified for me as well, that it's mostly about how do we situate absolute knowing, and how do we engage that critique of desire, which makes psychoanalysis so important. And it also, I think, our work brings us, to me, well beyond Kant in a way. Like it really does justice to Kant while at the same time recognizing the need to move beyond Kant in a way.
Yes.
Right. So that's I'm taking a lot away from this conversation. And I've benefited tremendously from this work. I would just say I'll give you the final word, but how I read this book, first it was like a challenge to approach. I think that's the sort of, if we're really going to read, and I think we should really read, there is always the question of how do I read this work, right? And I think that the way I've sort of outlined and made sense of this work is that you've got this triad of our nature and as map making beings, and this triad is being reflected upon under the question, how do we become better map makers? I think that given the challenge that AI capital is going to become the best map maker, the only way that we can become good map makers is in some willingness to confront the real that we abhor and to become true, which perhaps AI doesn't have access to that. In the loss of givens, philosophy recognized the problem of consistency. Then we move to the problem of situation where we failed it. And then you outline this problem of the totalitarianism and the proliferation, which I think outlines where we are in the 20th and 21st century politics, ultimately to bring us to the importance of the drive and the way in which that is crucial for situating in the context of AI capital success. And there is a hole there where there is the possibility of another world. And I take our life paths to be the attempt to outline and make a space for that world. So I'll give you the final word, but that's my attempt to wrestle with this thing.
Well, I really enjoyed this chance of speaking with you and to wrestle with you, and your work is invaluable for the thinking and passing through that narrow window that I do believe is possible. Something that actually gives me hope is when you look back at history, you see how many times the window was narrow and we did come through it, or we were like this close to blowing up the whole world a whole lot of times during the Cold War, or if one guy didn't end up in this place, the American Revolution doesn't occur. Like there's all of these radical narrow contingencies that actually did work out. And that doesn't mean they had to work out, but it's possible. And that's important, I think, because otherwise it seems like a pipe dream. I think also your work, Systems and Subjects, is absolutely in conversation and dealing with similar issues. I think it's a very important book. I think, obviously in the supplements we talk about real speculations, meaningful maps, global brain singularity, and real speculation. This is all very, very relevant to the topic. I highly suggest your work on real speculations because I think it is absolutely dealing with the same question of possibility of this narrow way that I think we need to think if we're going to think at all. I think it is also very important to see the differences between, as you outline and Dimitri talks about, between reason, spirit, religion, and absolute knowing. I think a lot of people are at risk of getting stuck at religion, which we've talked about with Jordan Peterson, and we have to realize that the logic of becoming a dragon is actually found in the hero who is a good hero. It is not hero versus dragon, order versus chaos. Order actually becomes chaos. Chaos actually becomes order. That A, B is in operation, and we have to manage that situation. And we can only hold that together as subjects. In the same way that a single map can't hold the maps together, we as subjects in the Gddel point have to hold maps together. But that requires the real. I am of the opinion that there is reason to think that form making and humans as form making is uniquely afforded to humans who face the real. I talk about the real as Lovecraft, sometimes with Lovecraft with the ancient ones tied with Dante and the beatific vision. The real affords both of those possibilities, but the only way to get to Beatrice, of course, is to go through hell and to follow Virgil and masters who are alien, because Dante's a Christian and Virgil's Greece and Athens, and he follows him. So the way to love in the Dante is counterintuitive. But if we cannot do that, then we can't hold the real without being reduced to ash, and then we can't be form makers. But I do think there is something to be said about humans as form makers that is the state in which humans and AI are in collaboration versus AI replaces humans. But we have to think that. And if we can't think that, we are in trouble. I do think what you're saying is that belonging again is a question of without givens, how do we belong? Well, we have to belong in the real. We have to belong in the Gddel point. We have to belong in this condition that generates the possibility of form making. And that actually would be not to waste rationality and drive. That would be actually to use them fittingly. I do not think critically that, and this I get from Hegel, and this book is not to say that we made a mistake in the past, that we did something wrong. Every historical episode reaches the point where the contradiction is unveiled that has not been addressed, that now has to be undressed. So the fact that we are facing this narrow window does not mean we made a mistake. It means that everything's going just according to schedule. Everything is just on time. Everything is happening as it ought to happen.
Confusion's masterpiece. There you go.
Absolutely, and it can be beautiful. The masterpiece can be beautiful from Macbeth, right? The death of the king. And so that is so important. We've spoken before with Hegel that instead of a state of nature, Hegel wants us to base philosophy on the state of now. If you think we made a mistake, then you'll be tempted to go back and correct the mistake, and now you're regressing. Right? There have been no mistakes. Everything is on schedule. There have been imperfections. There have been incompleteness, but the trajectory is exactly how it is supposed to be now. The issue is not, is history doing what it's supposed to do? The question is, are we doing what we're supposed to do? Are we taking on the real? Are we developing the character and facing the negativity necessary so that we can be more in the state of form makers, so that we can hold difference, and so that we can handle the real without being reduced to ash? Are we doing that, or are we running? Are we wasting our rationality on map consistency? Are we wasting our drive on making that consistency, or following just the logic of capital? Are we wasting that of which makes us human? If we are, that's what needs to be addressed, not reversing history. We need to face ourselves. And I always appreciate how you bring that to the forefront of your work, Gddel, and it's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Well, everyone, it's been Daniel Garner with Gddel Last. This has been The Map is Indestructible. I will leave a link in the description to The Map of Indestructible if you want to pick up that book along with its complement in the series The True is Not the Rational. I'll also leave a link to the first book in the series, as well as the link to where you can find all of O.G. Rose's work. So, highly recommend it. Thanks so much, Daniel, and until next time.
Until next time.
This August, we will be hosting philosopher Dylan Shaw, whose work orbits both the study of German idealism and the philosophy of religion. This month will function as an invitation to rethinking metaphysics with ancient, modern, and postmodern philosophy. To get involved during our live sessions this August, or to access the recordings indefinitely, sign up below.